Stop what you're doing right now and listen. NATO just did something massive for Ukraine. Putin should be concerned, as NATO has just signed a death sentence for Russia. How? Well, as we speak, the Collective Defense Alliance is working on a new plan that will provide Ukraine with exactly what it needs to end the Russian invasion once and for all: cold, hard cash. And if NATO decides to go ahead with its plan, and all indicators suggest that it will, Putin will be terrified of the ramifications. Not just for the Ukraine war, which will already be massive, but for what all of this means for Putin's plans to take on NATO once the war ends. And it all starts with a Ukrainian appeal. On June 11th, Politico reported that it had just spoken to a senior Ukrainian defense official. The outlet didn't say who. The official wanted to remain anonymous. But that official said that Ukraine is gearing up to make a huge request at the next meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which is also known as the Ramstein format. These meetings are used to formalize military aid deals for Ukraine, and the official made it clear what Ukraine is going to ask for. Everyone sees that Russia is burning, and we want to burn even more, but we need financing to do it, the official declares. How much does Ukraine want from its European and NATO allies? About $20 billion. It's a big ask, and Ukraine knows it. The plan, the official tells Politico, is that allies will be asked to contribute between $2 billion and $6 billion each to reach the target, and Ukraine will be happy to take that money as either military aid or a loan that it has to pay back. But for Ukraine, which already spends 40% of its gross domestic product or GDP on its military, an extra $20 billion would add substantially to the $38 billion already committed to Ukraine by NATO nations for 2026, and bring the country within touching distance of the $60 billion in bilateral aid target set by NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte back in May. Ukraine is going to set out its stall, but it may not have to wait for NATO to give the green light. As news has leaked of Ukraine's upcoming request, you can be sure that the leaders of NATO's member nations have already seen it. They know what's coming at the Ramstein format, and they're ready for it. Ukraine is going to ask for $20 billion. Well, NATO just said, hold my beer. It's not going to deliver $20 billion to Ukraine. What happens next will catch everybody off guard, as NATO is preparing to deliver a lot more than that to the one nation that is battling back against all of Putin's ambitions for Europe. What NATO is preparing to do right now would be a death sentence for Russia's invasion, because it would guarantee a flow of cash into Ukraine that goes far beyond what even Ukraine itself is asking. NATO sees Ukraine's request for $20 billion, and it's on the verge of agreeing to raise that request to over $80 billion. That's what Politico reports that NATO nations are offering in terms of military aid to Ukraine for the rest of 2026. The outlet spoke to 4 NATO diplomats who said that a proposal being circulated by Germany is currently under discussion within NATO, and it seems that proposal is edging closer to being agreed upon. If all goes well, NATO's $80 billion offer will be made at the Ankara summit of NATO leaders about a month after the upcoming Ramstein meeting. What a huge result that will be for Ukraine. It goes in asking for $20 billion, and it comes away with more than 4 times what it's asking for from the allies that are playing a huge role in ensuring that Russia's attritional war in Ukraine isn't won simply because Ukraine ran out of the cash that it needs to keep on fighting. A 5th NATO official tells Politico about the reasoning behind the offer that the Collective Defense Organization is preparing to make. The key is to have a firm commitment from Ankara to continue the crucial support to Ukraine on a sustainable and more equitable basis, the official says. But there's more to it than that. As part of this new funding, a mechanism will be put in place to ensure that all NATO allies, along with Ukraine itself, can see who is donating what. That's key to the entire proposal getting over the line, as there are some within NATO who believe that they are shouldering the burden for supporting Ukraine more than others. The Nordic countries, including NATO's newest members in Sweden and Finland, are among them. Back in November, the Swedish Foreign Minister Maria Malmer Stenergard had pointed out that the Nordic nations are taking on a disproportionate amount of the aid burden. The fact that the Nordic countries, with less than 30 million people, we provide for 1/3 of the military support that the NATO countries, with almost 1 billion people, provide this year. This is not sustainable, it's not reasonable in any way, and it says a lot about what the Nordics do. But it says even more about what the others don't do, Stenergard declared. A very pointed message, and one that the rest of NATO's members needed to hear. At the time, Sweden's foreign minister suggested unfreezing Russian assets held by European countries and delivering them to Ukraine. That still isn't an option that's on the table for those who hold the assets, though those assets are being used to underpin the $104 billion loan that the European Union has pledged to Ukraine. So the frozen assets are out, at least in terms of the idea of simply handing them to Ukraine. What's in is a new NATO proposal that will see over $80 billion land in Ukraine's lap, ready to be used to shove Putin's invasion right back where the sun doesn't shine. Here's what we know about the NATO proposal so far. First, we mentioned that this is a German proposal. The reason that it exists in the first place is that another proposal has been shot down by NATO's members. Back in May, at around the same time that Rutte set a target of $60 billion in aid for Ukraine, NATO's Secretary-General also proposed that each member of the NATO alliance dedicate 0.25% of their GDP to supporting Ukraine to hit his target. That approach, though equal when it comes to GDP, would naturally have led to some nations contributing far more to Ukraine than others. Germany, for instance, had a $5.048 trillion GDP in 2025, according to Statista. Giving 0.25% of that GDP to Ukraine would amount to a little over $12.62 billion, which is about a fifth of Russia's entire $60 billion target for 2026. The proposal required nations to make a consistent commitment to Ukraine that they wouldn't be able to adjust if domestic issues meant that they faced financial challenges. So it was rejected by several NATO nations, including France and the UK, putting the kibosh on Rutte's suggestion. The $80 billion in aid that is now being proposed under Germany's new mechanism started gaining traction following the refusal of Rutte's idea. NATO's new plan offers more flexibility, rather than tying member nations into donating 0.25% of their GDP. Plus, it ties into the European Union's loan, which we mentioned earlier. Politico reports that Germany's plan accounts for almost $35 billion in loan funding that has already been committed by the EU, which leaves about $45 billion to be provided via bilateral aid programs, assuming the proposal makes it through the negotiating stage and into Ukraine's hands at the Ramstein format. So there's a spoonful of sugar that will make the medicine go down far easier than it would have done under Rutte's proposal. To hit the $80 billion to be offered to Ukraine at Ankara, NATO's members have to collectively find less money than they would have to commit with a GDP-based plan. Speaking of money, this offer would also represent a substantial increase in the amount of funding being provided to Ukraine by NATO's members. In a June 4th analysis, the Kiel Institute reported that Ukraine's NATO allies are still maintaining funding at a relatively high level. Germany, for instance, allocated about $4.8 billion to Ukraine in both March and April, which was used by Ukraine to procure air defenses and drones. The UK delivered about $1.5 billion in aid during the same period, and other NATO nations delivered aid in the region of hundreds of millions of dollars over those months. So it's not like NATO nations aren't already spending big to help Ukraine. It's just that now they're gearing up to do more. And more money is always better for Ukraine when it comes to defending its territory against Russia's invading forces. What we're seeing here is NATO striking a compromise between commitment and protecting Ukraine. Suggestions have been considered and discarded, but now, with Germany's proposal, Ukraine is on the edge of receiving more funding than even its most ambitious officials expected to get. The $20 billion to be requested at the Ramstein format is on the verge of being quadrupled following the Ankara summit, and that's huge for several reasons. But before we dig into what those reasons are, if this is the kind of insight that you want to see, then you need to ensure that you're subscribed to the Military Show. We break it down like this every single day in our videos. So another $80 billion flowing into Ukraine's war chest matters. Here's why. First, this isn't just about helping Ukraine for NATO. There's a large degree of self-interest at play here, as many in Europe believe that NATO member nations are next on Putin's docket, assuming Russia's leader is able to win the war in Ukraine. One of the doomsayers is Lieutenant General Christian Freuding, who is the head of Germany's military. In a stark warning delivered on June 11th, he said that it's not a matter of if, but when Russia will invade a NATO partner country. All 32 NATO partners agree that Russia might have the capability to invade a NATO partner country in 2029, Freuding claims, adding, 2029 is not a German timeline, it's NATO-agreed intelligence. Russian military installations are being built up on NATO's borders as we speak, as construction work along the borders with Finland, Sweden, Norway and the Baltic states appears to be leading to the modernization of bases capable of holding around 115,000 troops, TVP World reports. Russia unleashes hybrid warfare attacks against NATO members regularly, as we saw in Romania toward the end of May, when a Russian drone struck an apartment block in the country. These sorts of incursions are getting more regular and, as Romania discovered, more dangerous. These are warning shots being delivered by Russia. Freuding says that it's about time that NATO started taking them seriously. Committing over $80 billion in military aid is an example of NATO taking things more seriously, as it's a clear recognition of the fact that NATO needs Ukraine. Though Ukraine isn't a NATO member, and the prospect of it becoming one is enough to send Putin into so much of a fury that it's impossible to predict what he would do next, it's fair to say that Ukraine is essentially acting as the front line in the war that Putin wants to start with the Collective Defense Alliance, and it's been serving in that role for over 4 years. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky certainly holds that opinion. On June 9th, he pointed out that Ukraine's battlefield experience alone makes the nation an asset to NATO, stating, "There is no price of this experience. It's not about money, it's about people's lives. We will share this priceless information. Having Ukraine in NATO is in the interest of NATO," Zelensky declares. NATO isn't going to let Ukraine in, at least not when the war with Russia still rages. However, Ukraine is more valuable to NATO now than many of its member nations. As the European Council on Foreign Relations points out, an end to the Ukraine war in any way that doesn't result in Ukraine's victory means that Russia will have time to position troops in preparation for the 2029 assault that Freuding says is coming. Ukraine needs to fight on, for NATO's sake as much as its own, and NATO knows it. So by committing $80 billion in aid for 2026 to Ukraine, NATO would be sending a clear message to both Ukraine and Russia. For the former, the support would show Ukraine that NATO recognizes how vital the country is as a frontline force against Russian aggression. And for the latter, $80 billion in military aid is money that Putin never expected Ukraine to receive, and it sends a clear signal that NATO has woken up to the fact that strengthening Ukraine now is the key to crippling all of Putin's plans for the future. If Ukraine falls, NATO countries are next for Putin. NATO has to stop that from happening at all costs if it doesn't want to see all of Europe plunged into war, and more military aid is the best tool that the alliance has. But speaking of NATO, there's a nation that has rather conspicuously gone without mention in this video: the United States. Ever since President Donald Trump entered office, the US has felt more like a wild card in the Ukraine war than it did under former President Joe Biden. Ukraine's relationship with the US has been tumultuous over the last 18 months, and though there is more stability now than there has been in a long time, the fact remains that the US isn't providing aid to Ukraine at the level that it was in the past. Some aid is still reaching Ukraine, though most of this was agreed under the Biden administration. But for the most part, as Politico points out, the Kiel Institute report that we mentioned earlier recorded no new military aid from the US. Militani adds that the Trump administration's request for a record-breaking $1.5 trillion defense budget for the 2027 fiscal year includes no indication that any of this money will be dedicated to Ukraine. That's the reality for Ukraine right now. The billions that were coming from the US under Biden have dried up under Trump. In place of America's aid is the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PEARL, initiative, which sees Ukraine's NATO and European allies committing money that allows Ukraine to buy weapons from the US. PEARL is basically a middle ground solution that allows Ukraine to get its hands on American weapons without the US having to donate them. But the fact remains, and seems unlikely to change, that Ukraine isn't getting much, if any, new military aid from the US for as long as Trump is president. That casts the $80 billion that NATO is preparing to pledge in a new light. That money is primarily coming from NATO's European members. There's no word on whether Canada will be involved yet, but the US almost certainly won't be. For Ukraine, this amounts to the rest of NATO stepping up to plug a gap that has been left behind by the US. This money is needed. The rest of NATO is ready to provide. As a little coda to this point, some in the US are trying to get the wheels turning on aid donations, so perhaps we can't discount the nation from the military aid equation just yet. In a June 12th report, the Kyiv Independent says that the US Senate Armed Services Committee has voted to extend US aid to Ukraine to the tune of $750 million as part of the 2027 budget just mentioned. However, this is just a bill, not a given. It still has to pass through the full legislative process, including debate and approval from both chambers of the US Congress. Still, it's a start, and it's one that Ukraine hopes could signal the revitalization of US aid to go along with what the rest of NATO is doing. Finally, there's Ukraine itself. $80 billion from NATO goes a long way towards solving problems and building on military solutions for Ukraine. On the problem front, Ukraine has spent a lot of money on defending itself against Russia. and that has created what the BBC calls an urgent fight on the financial front line. The outlet reports that Ukraine's government spending for 2026 is planned to reach $112 billion, with 60% of that money going to the country's armed forces. That spending leaves Ukraine with a shortfall of around $45 billion in its budget. $45 billion is precisely the amount of extra money that NATO's new proposal would put together on top of the $35 billion that has already been guaranteed to Ukraine by the European Union's loan mechanism. Those pieces fit together far too well to be coincidental. As for what Ukraine can do with the money, air defenses and drones are the priority, and the latter are already proving to be the game changer in 2026 as Russia's military struggles to make any meaningful progress in a spring-summer offensive that was supposed to cripple Ukraine. During the spring session of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Mstislav Banik, told attendees that Ukraine has the ability to scale up its drone production to a staggering 20 million units per year if NATO allies are willing to commit more money. That's 5 times more drones than Ukraine built in 2025, and it could become a reality if NATO pulls the trigger on Germany's proposal. Ukraine's drones are making a massive difference in the war right now. The country's drone advantage is already pronounced as Ukraine struck 180,000 Russian military targets in May, which is a 12.7 increase over April's numbers, per the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrsky. He says that Ukraine already has a 1.5 to 1 advantage on the FPV drone front, has built a formidable stockpile of interceptor drones that stop Russian Shahid drones in their tracks, and is building up a mid-range stockpile that is allowing Ukraine to shatter Russian logistics. Imagine all that Ukraine is achieving multiplied by up to 5, all due to more NATO funding. Russia would go from being stalemated in Ukraine to being forced to actively withdraw as Ukraine's drones wreak havoc on the battlefield. That's the possible future that lies in wait for Putin and his forces. A lot depends on Ankara. We'll learn in July whether NATO's proposal to grant $80 billion in aid to Ukraine becomes a reality. But now we have to wait and see what NATO's members decide to do on the financial front. Forged from the ashes of the Ukraine war arises something special. Unkillable, unstoppable. A metal machine unlike any other that is being developed not just by Ukraine but by one of its strongest allies. Sweden is making its mark on Ukraine's campaign against Russia, and it will work alongside Ukraine to bring something new to life: more. This new ground robot keeps soldiers alive by putting them into coffins, and it's coming to the battlefield. Meetings have been held, pen has been put to paper. The Maul is coming and Joint Forces has the details. On June 11th, the outlet reported that the Ukrainian company AI Drones UA has finalized a deal with the Swedish defense firm Njord Technology AB. At the Eurosatory 2026 event in Paris, which was held on June 16th, the two companies formalized a strategic partnership memorandum, making official a deal that will bring the Maul ground robotic system to Ukraine. That deal isn't simply one company buying from another. Ukraine and Sweden will be working together on the production of the Maul, and even more concerning for Putin, these two companies will also collaborate on the development of more robotic systems that will be brought to the Ukrainian battlefield. AI Drones UA explains more in a statement released on the day of the signing. Maul ground drone is a system developed based on real battlefield experience and is continuously improved through feedback from military users. Together with Njord Technology AB, we plan to establish joint production of the Maul platform in Sweden, which will expand manufacturing capacity and accelerate the delivery of robotic systems, the company says. This is huge for Ukraine. The new deal means that Ukraine finally has a through line for bringing large numbers of one of the most morbidly useful robots that has ever been created in greater numbers to the front line. Why do we say morbid? Well, you'll learn more when we dig into the Maul, but this robot is essentially a big coffin on wheels that is used to evacuate wounded soldiers from the front lines. A capsule opens, the soldier crawls inside, and the rolling coffin brings the soldier to safety, where they can receive treatment for their wounds and survive injuries that might otherwise have killed them. Ukraine is bringing a coffin that saves lives to a battlefield where Russian soldiers are dying in droves. The irony is palpable. And the deal that has just been signed isn't the first that we've heard of the Maul platform. Though Sweden is now getting involved in the production, it was specialists from Ukraine's 1st Separate Medical Battalion who developed the robot and first brought it onto the battlefield. Ukraine's big challenge during the early weeks and months of the Maul's existence was taking a robot that clearly worked and getting it into mass production, The first solution helped, though it wasn't a long-term problem. Maul was made part of a special fundraiser run by United 24 Media and Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs that have raised $620,000 for robotic platforms by June 4th and will likely raise much more in the months to come. That money helps, but the joint production deal signed between AI Drones UA and Njord Technology is far more important. So we come to the big question: what do we know about the Maul platform? We'll start with how it works, seeing as we've already given you some insight. Pravda reports the basics. Maul is a multi-purpose platform that can be used for casualty evacuations, as we've already touched on, or as a delivery unit that can keep supplies moving across the front lines. The coffin-like capsule built into the drone can be used to carry ammunition, food, and other supplies, while the drone itself is capable of tackling difficult conditions, including the snow-strewn landscape of Ukraine that is so commonly seen during the winter. Militarny has a little more information, as it reveals that the first version of the Maul appeared way back in May 2025. At the time, the Maul could travel at speeds up to 70 km per hour, and it's been designed to be capable of sustaining damage while continuing to plug along and, crucially, protect the cargo inside the capsule. The commander of Ukraine's 1st Separate Medical Battalion, who goes by the call sign Devi, explained what makes the Maul an unkillable and unstoppable machine. For example, we have specialized wheels. After this vehicle was hit and 2 wheels were punctured, they came off, but the design is well thought out. We were still able to return 10 kilometers back without issue. Therefore, even punctured wheels are not an obstacle for its return. What Ukraine has on its hands is a near-invincible ground robot. And its new deal with Sweden means that many Mauls are going to be coming to the battlefield very soon. Let's talk about this coffin business for a moment. In a video showcasing Maul, UATV English showed us exactly how the Maul's interesting capsule works. A coffin-like carrier was described as a first for unmanned ground platforms, as most will have something more akin to a stretcher placed on top of the wheels. That sort of solution works well enough when there is little risk. However, it leaves whatever is being carried exposed. Direct hits become problems, but even indirect hits can lead to cargo or people being spilled and unable to get back on the platform. The coffin-like capsule changes all of that. It wraps whatever or whoever is being carried inside a strong casing that protects against explosions and metal fragments. A peek inside only furthers the analogy, as we see soft stretchers, albeit with straps to secure whatever is being transported. We hope there is no need for those types of straps in an actual coffin, though that would perhaps help if the zombie apocalypse ever comes. We're getting sidetracked. The UATV video also gives us some insight into how the Maul works in practice. Hidden by a panel is a control system that is used to power the drone on. After that, everything is handled using a remote control that looks just like the sort of system you get with an RC car. A pair of small levers is used to handle the steering. The Maul has a parking mode, wheel lock, reverse mode, and can move at both low and high speeds. That level of control is vital. Ukraine doesn't want a robot that is supposed to be the savior for a soldier moving so quickly when it arrives that an accident occurs. The soldier showcasing the controls in UATV's video reveals he's only been in the unit operating the robot for a few months, and he's already picked up everything that he needs to know about the robot. That's good. The less time needed to learn, the quicker operators can get the Maul onto the battlefield, saving lives. The Maul also has a modular architecture, which means there's plenty of room for it to be adapted to specific missions as and when needed. Plus, the chunky wheels used for the platform ensure that it can handle most types of terrain. But perhaps the most important thing for Ukraine is the dollars and cents. For as impressive as the Maul is, the system is remarkably cheap to build. A single Maul costs between $22,000 and $33,000, depending on the type of communication system used in the robot, Pravda reports. For context, The Guardian reports that Ukraine recently raised the average monthly salary of a frontline soldier to the equivalent of $7,000 per month, which amounts to $84,000 per year. For that money, Ukraine could purchase 2 or 3 Mauls, which it can use to replace frontline soldiers involved in medical and logistical operations. Of course, frontline soldiers will still be needed for fighting, but the more troops Ukraine can replace with robots, the better. And there's more. Beyond the coffin capsule, the Maul offers several advantages over many of the other ground robotic systems that Ukraine is already using. You may remember that we told you earlier that the Maul can travel at speeds of up to 70 km per hour. That seems fast for a ground robot, then you're right on the money. UATV reveals that most ground robots top out at 35 km per hour because they use electric engines. Maul is different. It has an internal combustion engine that delivers more power, resulting in faster speeds. In a life-or-death situation, a robot that can literally double the speed of the other options available can make all the difference. Other advantages of this type of setup make themselves known during Ukraine's harsh winters. Cold weather, and particularly frost, can cause batteries to discharge much faster, UATV reports. That means less speed and, crucially, less distance that a robot can travel. The Maul and its internal combustion engine don't have that problem. As long as there is fuel in the tank, the weather isn't going to stop the Maul. For a freezing and injured soldier, that key difference between the Maul and most other ground robots is huge. We also mentioned the modular aspect of the Maul. On the tail end of the robot is a fiber optic connection, suggesting that fiber optics has been tested. UATV reveals that they have, and though the tests didn't go well, as fiber optic cables can get knocked loose from a robot driving over the type of terrain that the Maul has to handle, this idea may be revisited in the future when Ukraine has spools of the appropriate length and strength to make it viable. So far, all of this is very impressive. In the Maul, Ukraine has a ground drone that saves lives by bringing a coffin to injured soldiers. It's modular, multi-purpose, and thanks to the new deal signed between Ukraine and Sweden, it's about to be mass-produced. But we told you at the beginning of the video that the Maul has been forged from the ashes of the Ukraine war to be nigh unkillable. That wasn't hyperbole. Maul is already battle-tested and has proven how tough it is. But before we explain more, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. There's a lot more where this comes from, so make sure that you are subscribed so you don't miss a video. We take you back to November 2025. In that month, Ukraine's first separate medical battalion was called into action, and it deployed the Maul. Still a little-known quantity at that point, the ground robot faced a difficult task. The insider reports that a soldier was injured on the battlefield, but this wasn't any old injury. For 33 days, that soldier had survived with the help of field medics, but the time was running out. Ukraine had attempted an evac using ground robots already. Several evacs, in fact. 6 robotic platforms had started the journey to the wounded soldier, only to be destroyed along the way. With the situation getting desperate, the Maul was called to the field. Ukraine's new drone set out on a long journey, but as it drew nearer to the settlement where the injured soldier lay, which was under Russian occupation, tragedy almost struck. The Maul rode over an anti-personnel mine which exploded. For any other ground robot, that would have spelled the end, and Russia will be able to chalk up a 7th evacuation attempt that it had stopped. But the Maul kept going. Even with its damaged wheel, it was able to make it to the injured Ukrainian soldier. The coffin capsule opened, the soldier was loaded inside, and the Maul set out on its return journey, damaged wheel and all. In a perfect world, this would have been the end of the challenges. The Maul would have gotten back with no issues, but the battlefields of Ukraine are far from perfect. On its return leg, the Maul was beset by unmanned aerial vehicles. Russia knew what the robot was carrying, and it wanted to ensure that the injured soldier didn't make it back alive. One by one, the drones struck, but they couldn't stop the Maul, and, more importantly, they were unable to penetrate the incredibly strong capsule protecting the injured soldier. The Maul survived, and after a grueling 64-kilometer journey, 37 of those kilometers traveled on a damaged wheel, the Maul made it back to base. What this rescue shows us is that the Maul is far more than competent, it's unkillable. Russia threw everything that it had at the robot, and it still wasn't able to stop the Maul from achieving its objective. Pravda revealed that the armored steel used to make the coffin capsule is what saved the soldier's life in November 2025, and the strong mini-tractor wheels built into the robot are what allowed it to survive the mine. That damaged wheel is now kept at the 1st Separate Medical Battalion's control point as a souvenir of the strength of Ukraine's new machine. More missions have been carried out with the Maul since. But in this single story, we see everything that makes the signing of the deal between AI Drones UA and Njord Technology so important. The Maul is battle-tested. It's a proven lifesaver, and now it's coming to Ukraine in greater numbers than ever before. But what we're really seeing with this new deal is a microcosm of a much larger movement happening in Ukraine's military right now. Ground robots have been identified as the way of the future across the front lines for several reasons, and this deal just goes to show how Ukraine is accelerating the rise of robots in its battle against Russia. The key to Maul and other ground robotic platforms is that they reduce the risks faced by Ukraine's frontline soldiers, particularly those tasked with providing medical care or handling logistics. In the case of the former, Ukraine no longer has to risk an evacuation crew heading out to the front using vehicles and in some cases helicopters. Those crews typically involve 4 people, all of whom have to put themselves in the Russian firing line to get an injured soldier away from the front. The Maul is operated by a crew of 6, none of whom has to actually go to the front. A strike against an evacuation crew just means more injuries and deaths, but a strike against a Maul, well, you've seen how little effect they can have. Looking wider across all robotic platforms, Ukraine's ground robots are already saving an immense number of lives. both directly and by keeping soldiers away from the front. The Modern War Institute at West Point noted in March that Ukraine's general staff believes that using ground robots has reduced personnel casualties by as much as 30% since they were introduced into the military. For a country that has endured more than 4 years of war and likely somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 casualties, that sort of reduction is massive. Soldiers survive for longer when ground robots are in play, and that ultimately means that Ukraine's defenses remain strong. Ukraine sees the clear benefits, and it's been gradually increasing its use of ground robots since 2024. The Modern War Institute says that Ukraine produced around 2,000 of these machines in 2024. By the end of 2025, the yearly output had risen to 15,000, and according to The Insider, Ukraine plans to have contracted 25,000 ground robotic systems by the end of the first half of 2026, suggesting that it's aiming to reach a total of around 50,000 by the end of the year. This rapidly accelerating production schedule has been bearing fruit. Toward the end of 2025, ground robots were handling about 90% of the logistics operations in the contested cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnorad. Fast forward to 2026, and Ukraine has gone all in on using these types of platforms. In a June 13th report, Metsa said that Ukraine has deployed 1,028 ground robot complexes across the front lines in 2026, and those complexes have thus far been responsible for carrying out about 50,000 missions. Every single one of those missions is one that would have previously placed a human soldier at risk. Ukraine has also standardized 60 ground robots in 2026 alone, the outlet says, which means it has put the processes in place for the mass production of far more than simply the Maul. Euromaidan Press adds there are now 100 companies working on ground robots in Ukraine. There were precisely 0 companies doing this kind of work when Russia launched its invasion. There's an entire army of ground robots coming to Ukraine. The Maul is simply one of the most impressive of them all. The increase in the sheer number of ground robots being produced and deployed is being mirrored by more units learning how to use these vital pieces of equipment. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reports that 230 units are now using ground robots, up from 117, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for closer coordination between the government and Ukrainian industry to ensure the production of ground robots can be scaled up even further. Everyone must understand, this is about saving lives, Zelensky declares. And in the Maul, Ukraine has a robot that specializes in doing just that in more ways than one. And so we come back to the Maul. It's easy to boil down this new ground robot into a coffin on wheels that is used to save lives, but it's so much more than that. This robot represents what has made Ukraine such a tough nut to crack for Russia over 4 years. A constant stream of innovation centered around solving real problems on the battlefield has turned Ukraine into one of the world's most lethal combat forces, and robots like the Maul exist to ensure that lethality is maintained for as long as possible. And as the ink dries on yet another new contract with a European partner, the Maul can also stand as a monument to the alliances that Ukraine has built in the wake of Russia's invasion. Ukraine and Sweden have indeed forged something unkillable. But it's not just the Maul that can't be stopped. The alliance between these two nations is going the distance. And for Putin, who is a man who thrives on causing chaos and division, the unity displayed in this new deal is like a dagger to the heart. The Maul is coming, and we already know that mines and drones can't stop it. Though we've placed much of the focus of this video on the Maul and the utility of ground robots when it comes to saving lives, Ukraine's robots can do so much more. They're not just lifesavers and supply carriers. Some are killers. In January, a Ukrainian unit found a way to make a ground robot a dealer of death for Russia's forces.
Putin made the threats. The Baltic states are in Russia's sights as Putin rages about drones and NATO prepares for a future fight with Russia. Latvia is preparing. To defend itself against Russia, Latvia is erecting dragon's teeth all over its border. The jaws of the dragon are ready to snap shut. Putin's land forces aren't prepared for what the Baltic has in store for them. But it gets worse for Russia's leader. NATO is doing something even more massive on the Baltic borders that sends a clear message to Putin. Whatever you plan to do next, NATO is ready for you. Concrete is the counter to everything that Putin has in store. At least that's Latvia's approach, as it's erected dragon's teeth across its borders to serve as a dangerous anti-tank barrier to Russia's forces. These fortifications have become part of the much larger Baltic defense line that the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia agreed to erect, and the heavy row of pyramid-shaped dragon's teeth exist to show that Russia can't achieve the sort of fast breakthrough on the ground that would allow for a fast invasion of the Baltic territories. Latvia's LSM has the breakdown. as it notes that the Dragon's Teeth have been set up on land that Latvia's government expropriated for national defense purposes. Construction on the teeth began back in 2024, though the first rows of them weren't installed until a year later. Fast forward to May 28th, there are now dozens of Dragon's Teeth on Latvia's border, each arranged in 3 rows that stretch about 10 meters wide, with the gaps between them being so small that military vehicles from tanks to armored cars aren't able to drive between them. Latvia has been planning this for a while. The land that it expropriated hasn't just been snatched from its owners. A special commission has been created with the sole job of determining how much compensation those landowners will receive for handing over their property in defense of their nation. This is solidarity in action, the recognition that Russia presents a huge problem that needs to be solved. And as the head of the Narva Border Center, Antti Ensalu, points out, these new defenses are absolutely necessary. Speaking about Estonia's decision to do something similar in 2025, Ensalu said, "This is primarily necessary to improve border crossing security. About 5 years ago we had an incident where a vehicle from the Russian side breached the existing barriers. Installing barriers will help prevent unauthorized passage. Installing gates will also help better manage the situation on the bridge, for example, in the event of an influx of migrants." So these are all multi-purpose defenses. Plus, as we've just hinted, Latvia is far from the only Baltic state to erect concrete barriers along its borders. Latvia's new Dragon's Teeth join those that have been set up by both Estonia and Lithuania. Ensalu's comments were made back in August 2025, as Estonia engaged in a campaign to build gates and barriers across the Narva Bridge that connects Estonia to Russia. That bridge will be the main route that Putin's ground forces have to take if they want to cross the Narva River to pile into Estonia. And the defenses ensure that Estonia is able to completely control the flow of traffic into its country. Right now, that means stopping migrants that Russia is sending in their tracks. But in future, Estonia believes that these defenses could prove pivotal in stopping Russia's forces long enough for a NATO response to come and sweep Putin's marauding forces away. Lithuania did something similar, also in August 2025. That month saw the Baltic state complete the installation of Dragon's Teeth along its border with the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. The commander of the Lithuanian army, Raimundas Vaikšnoras, explained the move at the time, stating, "We are starting from the tactical level, specific obstacles on the border, and later we combine the entire engineering plan into one conceptual system. Translation, the Baltic states are getting ready for a Russian attack from all sides." The Dragon's Teeth being erected now just the first part of a wider cooperative defense plan designed to protect all 3 Baltic nations against Russia. Putin will be watching anxiously as he sees the Baltic states preparing for what he has planned. But there is something else that NATO has in store that will take Russia's leader from feeling anxious to leaving brown stains in his pants. Before we get to that, there's the issue of what Latvia's latest move means in the wider context of its defenses. Dragon's Teeth aren't just for show. They're part of the Baltic defense line we mentioned earlier, which the Liebe Institute at West Point has labeled as a military necessity as Russia pushes its luck and pushes buttons with NATO. The Institute says that what's happening on NATO's eastern flank is part of the most strategically calibrated defensive preparations since the Cold War, as the Dragon's Teeth that the Baltic states have built will be combined with a series of bunkers, trenches, surveillance systems and observation posts, all working in concert with a singular goal: delay Russia to buy time for Article 5 to be triggered so that NATO can send troops. The Baltic defense line amounts to a trio of layers, beginning with the types of anti-vehicle barriers that Latvia has just erected. They stop Russian tanks and armored vehicles in their tracks, and once stopped, those vehicles end up in the firing lines of anti-armor defenses that destroy them. Another layer of defense ends up being added with each Russian tank that burns. Each becomes a barrier in its own right, making it even harder for Putin's forces to break through. Speaking of fire, the second layer of the Baltic defense line combines a series of infantry bunkers and a trench system with command posts designed to coordinate the Baltic defense. Bunkers provide the perfect place from which to fire on the enemy, while trenches can also slow Russian armor down and create a nightmare for Putin's soldiers as they try to break through the Baltic borders on foot. And right at the rear of the line is the third layer of defenses, which combines ground sensors, observation towers, and reconnaissance drones that feed real-time data to NATO, allowing the collective defense organization to formulate an appropriate response. None of this is being done by accident. There is nothing haphazard about what Latvia and the other Baltic states are doing. In fact, every defensive measure being put in place today has been carefully planned and is a result of joint NATO operations that began long before Putin invaded Ukraine. Returning to the Dragon's Teeth, nobody is under any illusions that they alone can stop Russia's forces. That's not the point. The The concrete contraptions aren't some new inventions that Russia's military planners have never seen before. They've actually been around since World War II, to the point where they were once seen as somewhat outdated when it comes to modern warfare. But then that description can also be applied to the military tactics that Putin has been employing in Ukraine. Russia's strategy is to force through a victory using an approach that is almost a century old. Tanks still play a huge role in how Russia fights, as does sending cannon fodder on foot that exists to absorb ammunition in order to wear down an opponent. If Russia is going to fight like it's still the 1940s, Latvia and the other Baltic states are going to erect defenses designed to deal with that approach. Tanks have to be stopped. Dragon's teeth are one of the best ways of keeping Russia's increasingly aging metal monstrosities at bay. And when combined with carefully placed minefields, which the national interest implies is part of the Lithuanian aspect of the Baltic defense line, and may well end up being implemented across other Baltic borders, Dragon's teeth can be one of the most important defensive assets for dealing with the 21st century Russian military that doesn't seem to have progressed from the glory days of World War II. However, there's a stark reality that Putin has to face. Dragon's teeth and border fortifications across the Baltic borders aren't the only things that are going to be lying in wait for the Russian forces if they ever attack. NATO has something much more dangerous in mind, a response so lethal that it will force Putin to rethink his entire Baltic strategy. That new response is a game changer on the Eastern Line. But before we dig into that, if this is the kind of insight you want to see, make sure you are subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every single week. So the dragon has been unleashed, but as the dragon's jaws clamp shut on Putin's armor, Russia will have a lot more to worry about than the Baltic defense line. NATO troops are coming to the Baltic states in what may be the biggest sign yet that NATO is getting ready for war with Russia. Toward the end of May, Reuters broke the news that NATO is preparing to strengthen the eastern flank by assigning another army corps to the Baltic region. This isn't any old corps, it's the German Netherlands Corps, which was stationed in the western German region of Münster, but is now on its way to Estonia and Latvia to serve as a new layer in the defensive structure that NATO is building up to deter Putin. The German Netherlands Corps amounts to a serious military response to Putin's plans, around 1,100 personnel serving the corps itself, which may not seem like a lot, especially when accounting for Russia's cannon fodder strategy. However, the corps is less about the amount of manpower it brings to the table and far more about the role it plays in organizing troops to deal with a threat. During an emergency, such as Russian forces attempting to cross into the Baltic states, the German Netherlands Corps can have up to 100,000 soldiers placed under its command. NATO hasn't sent a minor force here. It's sent an army corps capable of coordinating the sort of response that can send Putin's patsies packing. What this all means is that NATO is preparing to completely transform the way it organizes the eastern flank. Right now, NATO forces that are stationed in the Baltic states and northern Poland fall under the command of the Multinational Corps Northeast, which is stationed in Szczecin, Poland. That corps isn't going anywhere. It's existed in Poland ever since the nation became a NATO member, and it's a huge part of the command structure that NATO has created for the Baltic region, Estonian World reports. The German Netherlands Corps will add to the command structure that NATO has already created rather than replace it. The benefits are obvious. Responsibilities for organizing a response to Russian forces can now be divided between two corps, allowing NATO to collectively respond much quicker to a crisis in the Baltic region than it ever could before. Mass at speed is how one unnamed military official described it, and that's just what the Baltic states need if Russia's forces invade. All of this feeds into the overall strategy that NATO has created for the eastern flank. The Baltic defense line holds up Putin's forces. The Multinational Corps Northeast and the German Netherlands Corps combines to arrange the ground-based response. The German Netherlands Corps has plenty of experience too. Throughout the 2000s, it's been one of the most active arms of NATO. Deployments to Afghanistan in 2003, 2009 and 2013 mean that it has relatively recent warfighting experience, and the Corps has also served as a standby component of the Land Component Command of the NATO Response Force, which is a task it fulfilled in 2005, 8, 2015 and 2019. Whether it's dealing with humanitarian operations or organizing a rapid response in a warfighting scenario, the German Netherlands Corps is exactly what Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia need to make the entire concept of the Baltic defense line work. Corps is also the exact opposite of what Putin wants to see in the Baltic region. Russia's leader has just learned that if you keep making threats, you're going to get a response. There's a major reason why the dragon is getting ready to clench its jaws, and NATO is sending another army corps to the eastern flank. The immediate and constant Russian threat to the Baltic states. The timing of all these Baltic and NATO moves is far from coincidental, particularly when it comes to Latvia. On May 19th, the Moscow Times revealed that Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service has claimed that Latvia is preparing to allow Ukraine to start launching drones from 5 military bases into Russian territory. Those bases, Russia claims, are Adazi, Silesia, Lilvada, Daugavpils and Yekapils. Russia isn't happy about what it claims to have discovered. Latvia says that it's all a lie. But Russia claims that it has determined the locations of drone launch points in Latvia from coordinates of drone debris, and it started to threaten retaliatory strikes against any nation that it claims is helping Ukraine to send drones into Russian territory. A supposed special warning has been delivered to the Baltic states, Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu has claimed. As is so often the case, there is a measure of hypocrisy to what Russia is claiming. It was only in early May that a pair of drones crashed at an oil depot in Latvia, prompting the resignation of Latvia's entire cabinet, including Prime Minister Evika Salina and Defense Minister Andris Spruds, amidst infighting over who was to blame. Russia claimed that the drones were Ukrainian, but Putin would have been rubbing his hands with glee when seeing so much infighting. The point here is that tensions are high between Russia and Latvia. A powder keg seems to be on the verge of igniting. Those tensions are only rising as a result of other actions that Russia has taken, which place Latvia and the other Baltic nations under immediate threat. On May 25th, Politico reported that the Baltic states are turning to Ukraine to help them create bomb shelters that could protect citizens against Russian drones and missiles. That move was prompted by a drone violating Lithuanian airspace the week prior, which resulted in residents of the city of Vilnius being encouraged to seek shelter as the country's president and prime minister were rushed into bunkers. Russia is becoming bolder with its drones, and the Baltic states are increasingly worried that what are currently aerial incursions will evolve into a ground campaign. And they should be worried. Also in May, Putin put pen to paper on a new law that authorizes the use of Russian military forces to protect Russian citizens abroad. According to the Kyiv Independent, the new law sees Putin authorize himself to essentially declare war to protect any Russian citizen who faces arrest, trial, detention, or any other sort of supposed persecution by a foreign state. Let's call a spade here. Russia has basically given itself permission to invade any country under false pretenses. The Kyiv Independent says there are about 40,000 Russian citizens in Latvia and more than 80,000 in Estonia. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what Putin is doing here. He's basically telling the Baltic states that any punishment doled out to these citizens for crimes that they might commit is grounds for an invasion. It doesn't matter if the punishment is justified. Russia is watching and waiting for an excuse, and the new law means that Putin can give the go-ahead for a war whenever he feels like it. NATO is doing something massive on its eastern flank because May has been the month when Russia signaled that it's intending to push things too far. But for the Baltic states, this is a reality that has been developing for some time. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia all know that they will be first in the firing line if Putin decides that he wants to extend the war in Ukraine into a war against NATO. When that war comes in 10 years, 5 years, or even in the coming months, the Baltic states have to do everything in their power to Putin-proof themselves. The rhetoric is being ramped up now, but the hybrid war has been going on for years. For example, Russian guards have been removing buoys in the Narva River that demarcate the border between Russia and Estonia since 2024. Russia is encroaching on the sovereignty of the Baltic states indirectly, and it seems to be gearing up to take a more direct approach in the near future. The Baltic states know that they're vulnerable. In April, Defense News reported that a study drafted by the Baltic Defense Initiative, which is a think tank based in Lithuania, suggested that Russia could overrun the Baltic states in just 90 days, especially if Russia follows the template of aerial bombardment created by the US in Iran during Operation Epic Fury. That doom and gloom scenario does make several interesting assumptions, including France withdrawing its nuclear umbrella from the Baltic states. Still, it's a worrying analysis and a wake-up call to the Baltic states and NATO. Something has to be done about the Putin problem. If Russia's leader succeeds in Ukraine, NATO's eastern flank may be next. NATO needs to wake up to this threat, and it needs to do it quickly. That's what we're seeing in Latvia right now with the deployment of Dragon's Teeth, and it's what we're seeing with NATO's decision to send the German Netherlands Corps to the Baltic region. Defences are being put in place. One of the most effective rapid response units that NATO has at its disposal is now heading to the Baltic. If Russia does attack, Putin won't have the easy ride that he thinks he'll have. The Baltic defence line stands ready. And it's going to keep getting stronger to ensure that nothing that Putin has planned will come to pass. Not that Putin is quite ready to start a war with NATO yet. He has plenty of problems with Ukraine to handle first, as well as a threat of his own to deal with in Russia's east. In the ultimate irony, Russia is losing ground in its east as it prepares to attack NATO's east, and that ground is being lost not to an enemy, but to a supposed ally.
Germany has been one of Ukraine's biggest supporters over the course of the country's war with Russia so far, delivering billions of euros in civilian and military aid. But Berlin just took its support to a whole new level, offering Kyiv something that it's wanted for so long: to be part of the European Union. This could change everything, drastically enhancing Ukraine's power and influence while leaving Russia and its president Vladimir Putin completely powerless. It's an unprecedented display of support, and it was officially put into writing by the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who recently wrote a letter to EU chiefs Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa. The letter was shared with news agencies on Thursday, May 21st, and promptly shared with the wider world. Merz began by acknowledging the difficult fact that Ukraine most likely won't be able to become a fully fledged member of the European Union anytime soon. It's obvious that we will not be able to complete the accession process shortly, given the countless hurdles as well as the political complexities of ratification processes. That's not what the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will have wanted to hear, as he's been pushing to have his country join the EU since the very start of its war with Russia. Indeed, it was only a few days after the invasion began that Ukraine officially applied to join the Union, with Zelensky suggesting that some sort of new special procedure be created to speed through the usual accession process. Several European leaders showed willingness to comply with this request, with numerous nations supporting some sort of accelerated accession that would grant Ukraine all EU privileges as soon as possible. Even then, however, those in the highest positions of power called for calm and warned that this sort of thing simply cannot happen overnight. Von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, said that she too supported the idea of Ukraine in the EU, but warned that it would take time. In the months that followed, Ukraine was asked to provide certain pieces of information, and by late June of 2022, the European Council had granted it the status of a candidate for accession, which put it alongside other candidates like Albania, Moldova, Serbia, and Turkey. But if Ukraine was hoping for a similar speedy resolution to the larger accession process, it would be sorely disappointed. It wasn't until December 2023 that the European Council officially decided to open accession negotiations with Kyiv, and the country had to wait 6 more months for those negotiations to actually commence. Still, as time passed, it appeared that Ukraine was inching closer to the EU membership it so desperately desired, following in the footsteps of other former Soviet republics like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which all joined the EU. In June 2025, however, Hungary, under the rule of Viktor Orban, who was long seen as Putin's inside man in the EU, blocked the opening of accession talks for Ukraine. And even though Orban has since been ousted, there have been numerous signs to suggest that full membership is still some way off. Merz himself, for example, said in July of last year that it could take a number of years, while von der Leyen said that the country could potentially join the EU by 2030 if it was able to maintain the pace of its ongoing reforms, which are necessary to meet the Union's strict standards. Ukraine doesn't want to wait that long, and leaders like Merz have been pondering alternative solutions to help get the country closer to its ambitions, which brings us back to the letter. Having admitted that full membership may still be some way away, Merz went on to write, "What I envisage is a political solution that brings Ukraine substantially closer to the European Union and its core institutions immediately." He then detailed his plan to grant Ukraine associate member status of the EU as a kind of interim arrangement before full accession can officially take place. It's important to note that associate membership does not officially exist in any EU rules or regulations at the moment. So Merz is effectively suggesting that the Union should create a whole new membership class exclusively for Ukraine, though it could theoretically be used for other countries in the future as well. The Chancellor went on to detail exactly what he believes this new status should include. More specifically, he said an associate member should be able to enjoy additional rights and protections compared to a usual candidate for accession, while also having additional obligations to fulfill in order to effectively earn those rights and protections. Among other things, Merz stated that as an associate member, Ukraine could be allowed to participate in EU meetings without voting rights. That's already a huge deal, because these are places where EU governments effectively come together to make big decisions. It's where they coordinate on sanctions against Russia, for example, or discuss how best to aid Ukraine via military or humanitarian means. It's also where they debate and decide on numerous other important matters that genuinely affect Ukraine, both now and moving forward, like energy policies, reconstruction funding, and diplomatic strategies. If Ukraine were able to be present in those meetings, then Kyiv's officials would actually be able to influence and shape discussions directly, rather than just relying on their allies to represent them and hoping for the best. They'd also be able to enjoy faster and more direct access to intelligence about how the EU is operating and the big political decisions its leaders are debating, along with the opportunity to lobby ministers and leaders in real time. That in turn could give Ukraine additional influence when it comes to deciding on the things that matter most, like sanctions on Russia and weapons procurement plans. Let's say, for example, that the EU was debating something like how best to seize or freeze Russian assets. Ukrainian officials would be able to directly explain how that move would actually impact the battlefield as part of the ongoing discussions, rather than having to rely on alternative diplomatic channels, which are often much slower and less effective. It would be a huge shift from how things currently operate, as despite having a lot of friends in Europe, Ukraine is still effectively not in the room when the big decisions are actually made. Merz's associate membership plan would give Kyiv a seat at the table, and this wouldn't just be a short-term benefit. The new EU members often have to spend significant time sitting in and learning the way Brussels actually works. Getting a foot in the door now would help Ukrainian officials become more familiar with EU decision-making practices and policies, easing the friction if and when the full membership actually comes. Merz also suggested that Ukraine could benefit from what he calls gradual integration into the EU budget. Analysts believe this could imply some sort of access to EU-funded programs and financial mechanisms. Again, the prospective benefits of this are enormous. War is an expensive affair, and Ukraine has been forced to churn through quite extraordinary amounts of money to defend its territory, fend off the near-constant Russian assaults, and develop new weapons and defenses as the war has progressed. The country also faces colossal bills connected to the devastation its towns, cities, and key infrastructure have suffered over the years, with certain regions suffering severe economic collapse. It's possible that a deeper level of access to the EU budget could help Ukraine secure the money it needs for reconstruction, new infrastructure development, industrial support, transport, and more. Of course, Ukraine already receives generous amounts of financial assistance from its European allies, but has often had to rely on the likes of loans and special financial assistance packages rather than more direct, integrated support via the European budget. In the long term, this could work wonders for the country's battered and bruised economy. We've already seen the incredible effects the EU budget can have on other nations, as European financial support has quite literally transformed the economies of Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states, to name but a few key examples. It's been used to construct roads, railways, and ports, as well as to improve digital infrastructure, education, research, and defense. For Ukraine, that level of financial access could help with rebuilding war-damaged regions, improving or modernizing some of the country's industries that have been somewhat overlooked or left behind during the war, and deepening integration with European supply chains, easing the country's dependence on older Soviet-era systems. In short, it can only be a good thing for the country's economic growth and future GDP prospects. But that's just the start. Merz's plan also includes an even bigger benefit that could dramatically affect Ukraine's chances of winning this war. But before we dig into that, this is why we make the military show, to explain how power really moves. If you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next. The German Chancellor also feels that if Ukraine is granted associate member status, it should include the ability to invoke Article 42.7 of the EU treaties on mutual assistance and defense. Article 42.7 is almost like the EU equivalent of NATO's Article 5, which states that if one member state is attacked, all other members should come to its aid. It clearly states, if a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member states shall have towards it an obligation of aid and assistance by all the means in their power. As soon as a member state triggers this article, there's no need for any formal European Council discussion, decision, or any sort of unanimous vote. Everyone should automatically come together to support the beleaguered nation. In Merz's terms, this will provide a substantial security guarantee to Ukraine moving forward, with both immediate and long-term benefits. It would also send a very clear message to Moscow that it's no longer at war with Ukraine alone, but with the whole of Europe. In a way, that's already been true for quite some time, as European Union countries and others outside of the alliance, like the United Kingdom, have supported Kyiv from early on in the conflict. However, this would quite clearly take things to another level, as EU nations would no longer simply be voluntarily helping Ukraine, but would instead be obligated to do so. This doesn't necessarily mean that EU troops would enter the war right away. We wouldn't be likely to see British, German, or French troops on the ground in the frontline combat zones, as the article actually states that each nation reserves the right to determine what sort of assistance it provides. Neutral countries such as Ireland, for example, could provide non-military support, while others could help out with the likes of intelligence, logistics, and economic support. Then, those with significant military budgets in defense industries like France and Germany could pledge anything from tanks and infantry fighting vehicles to air defenses and munitions. Again, this is already happening, but Merz's plan could enhance it quite significantly. Russia, meanwhile, would have to worry about what this decision entails, as any continued aggression in Ukraine could be treated similarly to an invasion of the European Union itself, triggering the type of response that the Kremlin's war machine may struggle to contend with. In the long term, this sort of protection could be invaluable for Ukraine. Zelensky has, on dozens of occasions, stressed the importance of security guarantees. He's often said that no peace deal will ever be agreed to unless Ukraine has some sort of clear assurance that there will not be a repeat of this war and that Putin won't be allowed to simply spend a few years rebuilding his armed forces before coming up with another excuse to invade all over again. The Ukrainian president may have once hoped that those security guarantees could come in the form of NATO membership. However, the chances of the country joining that alliance appear to be shrinking, with US President Donald Trump repeatedly rejecting the idea of Ukraine ever joining NATO. Arguably, the next best thing would be for Ukraine to become part of the EU, which seems a much more realistic prospect. And if Merz's plan comes to fruition, the former Soviet state could start to be treated like a de facto member far sooner than expected. That would give Zelensky the guarantees he needs to move forward with confidence while letting Putin know that any further aggression will not be tolerated. It could put Ukraine in a more powerful position if and when the next set of peace talks comes along, which may aid Kyiv in negotiating a deal that is more in line with its aspirations, which not only include an end to the fighting, but also the recovery of all occupied territories. In the future, those security guarantees could also massively benefit the Ukrainian economy. Because even now, with Ukraine's domestic defense industry going from strength to strength, investors are still wary about getting involved with the country's economy. Even if the war ended, they'd always have the fear about another invasion plunging the country into turmoil once again. If, however, Ukraine has an EU-backed security framework with member states pledging to support and protect it, then that would help to put investors at ease. In turn, more foreign companies would be likely to invest in Ukraine, which could lead to more factories and businesses being established. That means more jobs and greater GDP growth, and even more incentive for the countless refugees who were forced to flee Ukraine to go back home when the war ends and begin the next chapter of their lives. Again, this is something that we've seen elsewhere. After entering the EU, countries like Poland and the Baltic states became more prosperous and more appealing to investors from around the world. On top of all the aforementioned benefits, Merz also suggested that Ukraine could be given some sort of assistant rapporteur role in the Court of Justice of the European Union. In other words, the country would have a low-level judicial role in Europe's court structure. This wouldn't necessarily trigger any immediate benefits for soldiers fighting on the front lines, but it still matters a great deal, as it would help Ukraine integrate itself into Europe's legal system and become more familiar with the EU's judicial standards. In the long term, this could help the country proceed with its ambition of full EU membership, because in order to become a member of the Union, candidate states have to be able to abide by a strict set of rules and standards. Ukraine has struggled in the past with issues related to corruption, oligarch influence at the highest levels of power, and legal reform issues. But with closer ties to the European system, it could more easily align its own courts with the standards of the EU. That's so important because Ukraine clearly wants to be a full and proper part of the EU eventually, but the evidence shows that this process is still likely to take several years. It's been working hard to address certain issues and brings itself in line with the rule of law standards required for EU accession, but it's still falling short in certain areas. Merz's deal would give Ukraine the guarantees it needs much quicker, while also easing the larger process of accession. It would be a both short-term and long-term win for Ukraine and a devastating blow for Russia. At the same time, there are a couple of key caveats. Merz stated that any associate membership should also come with a sort of snapback mechanism, which would allow the country's status to be cancelled or revoked if ever Kyiv were to regress in its accession process or fail to uphold what Merz deems fundamental EU values. In other words, the country would need to continue along the same path it's been following so far, showing a clear commitment to meeting EU standards and doing its best to abide by all necessary rules and regulations. Otherwise, it would be kicked out. Fortunately, there's no indication that this would happen. Even though it's still a little lax in some areas and is actively fighting a war, which obviously makes things more difficult, the country has, in the words of the European Commission, demonstrated an impressive capacity to deliver on reforms. It's made notable improvements to its justice system and market economy, while also making efforts to tackle corruption and money laundering and introducing more rights for national minorities too. All of this is vital for both the short-term associate membership plan and the country's long-term full membership ambitions. The only other caveat with this proposal is that it could be seen as a way for the EU to potentially delay or even back out of granting Ukraine full membership in the future, as it could argue that associate membership status is sufficient for the country's needs. However, Merz and other EU officials have repeatedly stressed that plans are still firmly in place to make Ukraine an EU member eventually. In other words, Merz's plan doesn't aim to replace or supplant the full accession process. It's simply a stopgap solution, a way to get Ukraine the additional support and rights it needs to strengthen its position in the war. As Merz himself writes, My proposal reflects Ukraine's particular situation, a country at war. It will help facilitate the ongoing peace talks as part of a negotiated peace solution. He adds that this is vital for the security of both Ukraine itself and the entire European continent, and seems to suggest that the associate membership could come quite soon, noting that he hopes to discuss the idea with his fellow European leaders in the coming days and stating, "My aim will be able to reach an agreement soon, and to set up a dedicated task force to work out the details." Merz even said that the Balkan states as well as Moldova should also receive additional support regarding their accession to the Union, though he doesn't suggest that they too could become associate members. Overall, Germany continues to lead the way when it comes to not just supporting Ukraine but securing the future of the European continent. And should Chancellor Merz's plan be approved, we could soon see far greater ties between the EU and Ukraine than ever before, with even more support in even more forms and a whole host of new problems for Putin to ponder.
Compared to previous spectacles, the 2026 annual Victory Day parade in Moscow was remarkably subdued. While the public did get to see the usual columns of tanks rumbling through Red Square, they did it from a unique vantage point, a video screen. The reason? Drones. Ukrainian drones are threading through the Russian capital's layered air defense network, and Russia was worried they would strike during the parade itself. In mid-May, the drones reached the Solnitsynogorsk oil loading station, causing black smoke to curl over a city that Russian President Vladimir Putin had spent 4 years assuring his citizens were safely out of reach. The Moscow refinery, one of the most defended industrial facilities in all of Russia, has been struck. Moscow's airports have grounded every commercial flight within hundreds of kilometers for what feels like the 100th time. Robert Brovdy, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, posted 6 words to social media that morning: "Moscow from now on never sleeps." Let that sink in. Ukraine, a country that Russia invaded expecting to conquer in a weekend, is now striking the Russian capital at will, and is not even using sophisticated missile systems that the West provides. No, it's doing so with drones that in many cases cost a few $1,000s, while they slip past air defense systems that cost tens of millions. The Russian government, in response, has placed Pantsir S-1 air defense missile launchers on the roof of the defense ministry itself. The seat of Russian military power is now wearing its own air defense system like a helmet in plain sight because it has no other choice. It has some speculating that Russia will never win in Ukraine. So, how did it come to this? The easy answer is drones. And yes, we're going to talk about drones a lot. But drones are not the whole story. The real reason Russia cannot win in Ukraine has nothing to do with NATO or sanctions or Western weapons or Ukrainian courage, though all of those things matter. The real reason is far simpler. Russia lost this war in the planning room before a single soldier crossed the border on February 24, 2022. It lost because of one catastrophic, irreversible mistake. Russia was overconfident, and by the time it realized just how badly wrong things had gotten, the window to fix it had already closed. So today, we're going to walk through exactly how that happened, starting with the war Russia thought it was fighting, going through the doctrine it brought to a fight it fundamentally misunderstood, and then tracing the chain of consequences, all the way to those drone strikes over Moscow that flowed directly from that original sin of arrogance. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what Russia's leadership actually believed would happen when it crossed the Ukrainian border on February 24, 2022. They believed it would be over in days. This was the operational foundation of the entire campaign. Russian logistics planners, this is documented, prepared resupply chains based on occupying Kyiv within 10 days. Note that this didn't mean capturing Ukraine entirely. The assumption was that once Russian forces reached the capital and the Ukrainian government collapsed or fled, resistance would evaporate, and the rest would be similar to what had happened in Crimea in 2014. As a result, tanks ran out of fuel and soldiers ran out of food. Not because Russian logistics were uniquely incompetent, but because the entire system had been built around a sprint, not a marathon. Think about what that actually means. The Russian military planned meticulously just for the wrong war, and the plan exposed everything: the overconfidence, the contempt for Ukrainian resolve, and most fatally, the decision to send a force that was large enough to make noise, but not nearly large enough to actually win. On paper, Russia had one of the most formidable militaries on the planet when it invaded. Hundreds of thousands of active duty soldiers, thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, an aerospace force with more aircraft than almost any other nation on Earth, hypersonic missiles, nuclear weapons, one of the world's largest military budgets for years running. By pure numbers, Ukraine had no business competing with any of that. And Russia didn't use it. The initial invasion force was somewhere between 150,000 and 190,000 troops. This was a significant number, but not the overwhelming, all-consuming wave you deploy when you're serious about conquering a country of more than 40 million people. For context, the United States coalition deployed roughly 700,000 troops to liberate Kuwait from Iraq in 1991, a country with a fraction of Ukraine's size, population, and military capability. Russia's planners apparently looked at those numbers, looked at Ukraine, and decided they could do it with a quarter of that, on the assumption that Kyiv would fall before serious resistance could organize. Looking back, it's not fair to say Russia was completely out of its mind in thinking it could pull it off. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea in a matter of days with almost no military resistance. And in the eastern Donbass that same year, Russian-backed separatists carved out 2 breakaway republics with a combination of local proxies, covert military support, and political chaos in Kyiv. None of that required an overwhelming commitment of force, only the fact that Ukraine was caught unaware and reeling from its own economic issues. There was also a significant intelligence failure layered beneath the doctrinal one. Russian military intelligence, GRU, and the FSB both reportedly assessed Ukraine's will to resist as low. Part of this was simply because Russian intelligence networks in Ukraine were optimized for political infiltration and economic leverage, not for accurately assessing military morale and combat readiness. Part of it may have been deliberate distortion by analysts who understood that delivering bad news to Putin was professionally dangerous. Whatever the cause, the assessment was that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would flee, that Ukrainian military units would stand down, and that the population would welcome Russia like there was still a Soviet nation. All of it proved catastrophically wrong within the first 72 hours. Ukrainian territorial defense units flooded recruiting offices. Civilians made Molotov cocktails. Zelensky famously declined an evacuation offer. The psychological collapse that Russia had planned its entire operation around simply didn't happen. No plan survives first contact with an enemy, especially one that's decided collectively and defiantly not to comply with it. With Plan A going nowhere and there being no Plan B, the war becoming one of attrition was practically a foregone conclusion. The exact reason why Russian intelligence failed to capture that vital tidbit of information and arguably start the war was that Ukraine changed massively, and it has no one but Russia to thank for that. After 2014, Ukraine started moving closer to the West in terms of ideology, but it also approached NATO to train its forces. That meant 8 years of world-class training, Western equipment donations, and experienced veterans from the Donbass fighting. The result was a campaign built on a fantasy. Russian forces advanced in multiple directions simultaneously, toward Kyiv from the north, toward Kharkiv in the northeast, and toward Kherson in the south. This spread their already insufficient force across an enormous front, on the assumption that none of these axes would face serious resistance, and that the Ukrainian resistance would collapse once the capital was threatened. When Ukrainian forces stopped them cold at Hostomel Airport, which was the planned gateway for an airborne seizure of Kyiv for the very first day of the invasion, the entire logic of the operation began to unravel. This directly led to the famous 40-mile tank convoys, which were now stuck because the first operation in the war went terribly, and Russia couldn't back out since it never planned to. By April 1st, 2022, barely 5 weeks into what was supposed to be a 3 to 10 day operation, Russia was retreating from the entire Kyiv Oblast. It had revealed to the entire watching world that its military was a paper tiger built on corruption, inadequate training, and decades of institutional mythology about its own invincibility. But here's the critical point, and this is what the rest of this video is about. The retreat from Kyiv was not the end of Russia's overconfidence problem. It was just the first and most visible consequence of it. The deeper ones were still working their way through the system. And for that, we need to dig again into Russia's military doctrine, or rather, how it planned to wage wars in general. Russian military doctrine, in its modern form, is a direct descendant of Soviet deep battle theory, a concept developed in the late 1920s and 1930s. The core idea was elegant and hinged on the idea that rather than grinding through enemy lines from front to back, you attack simultaneously along the enemy's entire military. This included the front line, reserves, logistics, and even command centers, creating simultaneous crises everywhere so that the enemy can't respond to all at once. In practice, this requires immense coordination between air and ground troops, command and logistics. Vitally, it posits that all the orders come from above and are distributed down the chain of command without modifications. But this method has one catastrophic vulnerability. It only works if your command and control are functioning. If orders don't get through, commanders can't talk to each other, or tactical units lose contact with their operational headquarters, the whole synchronized machine grinds to a halt. And here's where one of the most overlooked advantages Ukraine brought to this fight comes into play. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union until 1991. Its military officers grew up inside Soviet doctrine, and they attended Soviet military academies. When Russia launched its invasion, Ukraine was fighting an enemy that it intimately knew, particularly since the enemy was playing by the same rulebook it used just 8 years before. And Ukraine adapted to the fullest. Beginning after 2014 and accelerating under direct NATO guidance from 2016 onward, Ukraine deliberately retrained its officer corps away from Soviet-style command structures and toward a NATO mission command philosophy. In the old Soviet model, which Russia still uses, orders flow downward rigidly, and subordinate commanders need to execute those orders with minimal deviation. The system is designed to be controlled from the top. Ukraine deliberately broke that model. It trained its company and battalion commanders to make independent decisions based on the enemy's intent and the most advantageous position at the time, without waiting for permission from above. It focused on units that could work in isolation, precisely because they would be forced to when pitted against a larger enemy. This mattered enormously for two reasons. First, it made Ukrainian forces far more resilient under Russian electronic warfare and signals intelligence operations. Russia's jamming capabilities were designed to target the centralized communication architecture of a Soviet-style military, where you had a single brigade network, a few key nodes, and predictable radio frequencies. Against a decentralized force communicating over short distances through many small nodes, those tools became far less effective. Case in point, Ukrainian small unit commanders organized ambushes using anti-tank weapons and operated with irregular tactics that consistently surprised Russian forces, expecting a structured, predictable opponent. Second, and more directly relevant to the opening months of the war, Ukrainian commanders at every level understood exactly how a Russian unit would behave under pressure, because they'd been trained in the same system and knew precisely where the pressure points were. And the most visible pressure point was the Russian chain of command itself. As mentioned, Russian military doctrine concentrates authority at the top and expects senior officers to manage tactical situations personally. This also means they move forward to supervise operations directly. Ukraine recognized this pattern and systematically targeted Russian command vehicles, communications equipment, and the commanders themselves. The kill rate among senior Russian officers in the early months of the war was staggering by any historical comparison. Russia lost 5 generals to Ukrainian artillery and precision strikes in the first weeks of the conflict. This showcased just how fragile the system was when you needed high-ranking officers near the front line and had an enemy that could take advantage of that. The Russian military doctrine also makes extreme use of air power, which is another vital breaking point that led to the war becoming as is. For one, Russian ground combat mechanics practically assume air superiority. The entire theory of combined arms deep battle requires that Russian aviation is free to operate in support of ground forces. This includes suppressing enemy defenses, striking logistics, and even providing close air support to advancing infantry and armor. As such, Russian ground formations are not designed to fight without that overhead cover. Their tactics, formations, and the tempo of combat they were designed to sustain all presuppose that the skies would be theirs and there'd be someone to back them up. But the skies over Ukraine didn't belong to Russia for a single day of this war. This can also be traced directly back to Russia's opening overconfidence. To achieve air superiority, you must first suppress enemy air defenses. So Russia launched over 1,100 missiles at Ukrainian targets in the first 3 weeks of the war, striking, or attempting to, at about 75% of Ukraine's anti-air defenses. But Ukraine had dispersed its mobile surface-to-air missile systems before the invasion began, saving most of them from the initial strikes. From that point, the Russian Aerospace Forces, or VKS, were operating in a contested environment they hadn't planned for against an air defense network they had failed to destroy, with a stockpile of precision munitions already depleting rapidly. By early April 2022, barely 6 weeks into the war, the VKS had effectively stopped attempting to penetrate Ukrainian airspace in any sustained way. It retreated to launch standoff strikes from Russian territory well outside of the range of Ukrainian air defenses. But without close air support on the scale originally envisioned, Russian armor and infantry often had to advance with limited overhead protection. And without effective air interdiction of Ukrainian supply lines, Western weapons kept flowing to the front. Without fully suppressing Ukrainian artillery, those artillery systems continued to operate and inflict heavy losses. Every ground offensive Russia has conducted since April 2022 has been shaped by its inability to establish the kind of air dominance that most modern militaries would consider essential. Rather than acknowledging that their doctrine had failed and rebuilding around a new reality, Russian military theorists largely concluded that their concepts were correct all along, and that the failures were due to poor execution and unforeseen Western support for Ukraine, not fundamental flaws in their doctrine. So Russia was overconfident to the point where their system couldn't admit its own failure, playing the same tune for months on end while its soldiers died. And once those opening months ended and the siege of Kyiv was a part of military history, Russia itself started to decline. By that point, most analysts were starting to realize it was going to be a long war. But a long war meant Russia needed to mobilize its actual military power, the kind it hadn't deployed in February because it hadn't thought it would need to. Most importantly, Russia would need more modern equipment and access to technology, but by that time, the window to acquire it had already closed. Just hours after the invasion began, the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and dozens of allied nations imposed the most comprehensive package of economic sanctions in modern history. Over the following weeks and months, those sanctions were specifically and deliberately targeted at the technology inputs that Russian military production depends on. They stripped Russia of accessing microelectronics, semiconductors, advanced machine tools, and precision manufacturing equipment. It meant Russia couldn't build new guidance chips, communications hardware, or even advanced drone control systems. The reason why the sanctions were particularly devastating was that Russia is a big hypocrite. Russia's military-industrial base had been dependent on Western and Western-aligned technology supply chains for decades. Its modern missiles use Western microelectronics. Its tanks use Western-made machine tools in their manufacturing process. Its electronic warfare systems required advanced chipsets that Russia's own semiconductor industry couldn't produce domestically. This all comes from the Royal United Services Institute, which documented this dependency, suggesting that anything that Russia needed for the military, it was the Western supply chain that provided it. Of course, sanctions never have immediate consequences. Russia had some of the largest stockpiles of Soviet-era equipment, and a lot of that equipment was simply shelved rather than dismantled. So it could feasibly throw it back into the war. But Russia couldn't replace those stockpiles with modern equivalents. The scramble that followed tells you everything about how badly Russia had miscalculated. Russia quickly turned to Iran for Shahed attack drones. These are loitering munitions that Tehran had been developing for years, and that Russia, in its overconfidence about its own capabilities, had never bothered to invest in seriously before the war. Then, it turned to North Korea for artillery ammunition, reportedly importing millions of shells on par with its domestic production. When that failed, it was time for the stockpiles. So out came the T-62 tanks that were built in the 1960s and 1970s. After that, there were reports of T-55s and even T-34s, equipment that was actually used in World War II. The latter efforts were laughable, and Western news outlets and our own videos showed just how pointless it is to bring a World War II tank to a modern battlefield. But they were numbers, and they managed to give Russia just a bit more time to sustain its war effort. But this was meant to be fighting a war at a dramatically lower technological level. And the critical point here is the timing. If Russia had entered the war with its full military weight from day one, the sanctions still would have come, but they would have arrived in a Russia that had already achieved its core objectives and occupied the territory it wanted. The sanctions would have been applied to a Russia that was consolidating a victory, not one that was scrambling to survive a war it had fumbled the opening of. By that point, Russia could overturn the sanctions by having a new swathe of territory, rich with resources, and China as an ever-willing buyer for them. But by choosing overconfidence over overwhelming force, Russia ensured that the sanctions arrived while it was still fighting and before it had achieved anything that would have given it leverage to negotiate their removal. With all of that context established, we can now look at the drone war. Remember, this isn't a separate phenomenon from what we've seen so far. Even here, Russia's overconfidence is arguably the deciding factor in how Ukraine has managed to defend itself for so long. Here, we can separate the war into three different fronts: the close fight at the front line, the middle strike campaign around the occupied regions of Ukraine and neighboring Russian oblasts, and the deep strike campaign targeting Russian territory itself. And Ukraine is winning all three. On the front line, the numbers are brutal. By mid-2026, small FPV drones, which are drones carrying explosive warheads, often costing just a few $100s to manufacture, accounted for around 80% of all casualties on the battlefield. Both sides use them, but Ukraine has pulled decisively ahead. Russia made some progress in closing the tactical drone gap in 2025, which was partly responsible for the battlefield gains it made that year. But that progress has stalled, and for a simple reason: Russia can't recruit the people it needs to operate its drone forces effectively. Russia's unmanned systems forces set ambitious targets for recruiting tech-savvy young graduates. These were exactly the kind of people who have the reflexes and spatial awareness to operate FPV drones effectively in a fast-paced, high-pressure combat environment. In 4 months of active recruiting, they hit only 16% of their target. The underlying reason is not complicated, as joining the Russian military is simply not attractive to educated young Russians. They're well aware of what happens at the front, and they don't even have any enforceable guarantee that they won't be reassigned from a drone control station to an assault infantry unit the moment a commander needs bodies for an attack. Then there was Russia's attempt to expand its premier Rubicon drone unit. This was once the most capable formation on the Russian side and was responsible for Ukraine steadily losing access to drone infrastructure. But as entry standards dropped and Russia tried to scale it to fill the entire front line, the resulting force was much larger but dramatically less capable. Finally, Russia stumbled under the curse of its own military doctrine again. Instead of letting the unmanned forces be relatively independent from the rest of the frontline efforts, Russia tried to centralize their operations to be in line with major assaults. This ultimately meant Russia was throwing drones at Ukraine where they were actually expected, and Ukraine could use its most sophisticated defenses to counter them. The result was that some of Russia's most capable drone operating units had fewer drones and fewer operators. A big reason why Ukraine has managed to do this is precisely that it doesn't have a rigid command structure, and its innovation mechanism follows suit. On the Russian side, the drones might be innovated upon quickly, but they still succumb to Russia's lack of independence when it comes to testing and using them. But when Ukrainian drone operators identify a Russian countermeasure, they immediately start designing a response to test in the field within days. A new variant of the drone can reach frontline units within weeks. This feedback loop from the front line to the factory is short, fast, and supported by Ukraine, having all manufacturers endlessly testing and working with pooled resources, primarily through the Brave One cluster. Russia's equivalent loop needs to run through layers of command approval, procurement bureaucracy, and a military culture that historically punishes tactical initiative rather than rewarding it. The result is a technological gap that widens not because Ukraine has more resources, but because it iterates faster. And given that drones have become practically ubiquitous, that speed of evolution is all that matters. And when Russia tried to innovate, it got hit by the sanctions again. Russia invested heavily in fiber optic guided FPV drones. This is a genuinely novel tactical option because fiber optic control is immune to electronic jamming. In fact, in early reports, Ukraine was more afraid of fiber optic drones than anything else in the short-range portion of the front line. Russia was the first country to use the drones this way, and arguably the reason why Ukraine followed suit. The drones were simply that effective when there was hardly a way to disable them. But a 50-kilometer spool of fiber optic cable that costs around $300 in 2022 costs around $2,500 in 2026, all because the global supply chain for this material has tightened dramatically as demand from both sides of the war has surged. Surprisingly, both Ukraine and Russia import most of their cable from the same Chinese suppliers, showing how China is actually playing both sides of the conflict for economic advantages. Ukraine is far less reliant on cable-guided drones, already having hedged into radio control systems that can be mass-produced far more cheaply. Russia made a significant technological bet and is now paying a premium for it that compounds with every passing month. Ukraine also has the advantage of having the motivation and the innovation culture that a grinding attritional war forces on the defending side. Ukrainian drone operators are fighting for their homes, and it has Starlink. The near-total removal of Russia's access to Elon Musk's satellite communications network was genuinely game-changing. There is no Russian equivalent to Starlink, no cheap, near-unjammable, high-speed satellite communications system available to frontline units. That asymmetry shows up in every single tactical drone engagement. Moving up to the middle strike domain, the 13 to 130 mile band between the front line and Russia's rear areas. In here, Ukraine has transformed this space into a systematic degradation campaign. President Zelensky announced in early May 2026 that missile strikes had doubled since March and quadrupled since February. So Ukraine moved from defending itself to actively aiming to cut Russia's access to the front line all through drone warfare. The Center for Information Resilience tracked a 300% increase in Ukrainian attacks on Russian air defense and electronic warfare assets in just March and April of 2026. That was nearly 80 systems targeted in 8 weeks. Air defense systems are expensive, slow to manufacture, and the cumulative loss creates a feedback loop. Each system destroyed makes the next drone raid more effective, which makes it easier to destroy more systems, which enables deeper and heavier strikes, and so on. For the middle range, Ukraine has been increasingly relying on domestic production, peaking with the FP2 drone. It carries a 220-pound warhead, capable of destroying or at least disabling any Russian armored vehicle, and it's been used to devastating effect against Russian air defense systems in particular. When German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius visited Ukrainian frontline command centers in May 2026, Ukrainian commanders showed him footage of FP2 drones demolishing Russian air defense systems one by one. The symbolism was that Ukraine already had drones that were on par with anything the West could design, and these drones were now finding targets. For Russia, this meant it had to reorganize the campaign again. Before, Russian ammunition dumps and command posts could sit 40 to 50 miles out of the front lines. This was close enough to supply units quickly and for commanders to maintain effective oversight, but out of Ukraine's artillery range and short-range drones. By mid-2026, the ammunition depots had to be moved further back and into Russia's territory. And that wasn't really enough, courtesy of long-range drone warfare we'll discuss a bit later. But when the logistics chain has to run twice as far under constant threat of drone attack, the rest of the structure starts falling apart. Some Russian units have reportedly cut diesel consumption by 20% simply because they can't reliably get fuel forward anymore. Command and control have become fractured. Russian commanders, who are supposed to be managing an active battlefield, are instead coordinating supply lines from increasingly remote positions. This was showcased by Azov Corps footage published on May 8, 2026. It detailed Hornet drones, costing around $5,000 each, compared to the roughly $68,000 Russian Lancet X-51 with a similar profile. The Hornets were flying uncontested at low altitude over the Russian-occupied cities of Donetsk and Mariupol, hunting logistic vehicles along major highways 100 miles behind the front line. The presence of drones over territory that Russia had fought for 4 years to occupy is a good indicator that it's no longer the top dog in the mid-range field. Finally, there's the deep strike portion of the war, where Ukraine has made strides in creating campaigns to target Russia's most important infrastructure, and this is perhaps the biggest reason Russia has been so worried at the victory parade in 2026. When the war started, Ukraine essentially had no domestic long-range strike capability. 4 years later, it launches more than 100,000 drone sorties per month. The strike campaign has targeted Russian oil infrastructure with systematic cumulative intent. Refineries in Krasnodar Krai, Ryazan, Perm, Stavropol, and near the Baltic ports at Primorsk and Ust-Luga have all been hit. The Perm strike in late April 2026 is notable because the facility sits more than 1,000 miles from the Ukrainian border, deep inside the Ural Mountain zone, where Russian planners had arguably considered it beyond practical reach. The pace of strikes on oil infrastructure forced Russia to cut crude production by an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day in April 2026 alone. This was the sharpest monthly decline since the COVID pandemic. Yes, this accounts for a single-digit percentage of the entire production pipeline, but it shows that Ukraine has systems that can meaningfully endanger Russia's economic foundation, since oil and gas historically accounted for almost 40% of the government's revenue. But industrial and military targets have also been a major part of its campaign. Ukrainian drones struck the Radar Scientific and Technical Center in Rostov, a major fertilized plant in Stavropol Krai, producing chemical used in explosives manufacturing, and a Shahed and Iskander component facility in Cheboksary, using Flamingo cruise missiles in May 2026. The last point is critical because it means Ukraine is using drone warfare to disable Russia's own drone warfare capabilities. Behind this lies one of the largest overhauls in military-industrial history: Firepoint. This startup was founded by engineers, architects, and game designers in makeshift workshops in 2022. 4 years later, it produces a signature 100 FP1 drones per day at a unit cost of around $55,000. The FP1 has a range of 1,000 miles and is primarily used for surveillance and single-target precision strikes. Another hallmark is the FP5 Flamingo cruise missile, with a stated range of 1,800 miles and a 2,200-pound warhead. President Zelensky described it as Ukraine's most successful missile. But Firepoint has not stopped at the Flamingo. In February 2026, the company conducted the first test launch of the FP7 medium-range ballistic missile, with a supposed range of around 130 miles, just enough to match the aforementioned mid-strike targets. And in March, Firepoint chief designer Dennis Stielerman announced the FP9, a longer-range, heavier ballistic missile that the company claims would reach Moscow by summer 2026. The key for the FP9 is speed. While Russia's Iskander ballistic missile impacts at around 800 meters per second, Stielerman says that the FP9 will hit at over 1,200, fast enough to outpace interceptor missiles that surround Russia's most vital targets. It's estimated that 1 in 4 FP9s could feasibly reach their intended targets. For a country that couldn't build a drone 4 years ago, that's something that Russia needs to rethink. This is the compounding problem Russia faces on the deep strike front. Each new drone that Ukraine designs and lobs at Russian forces forces Russia to invest in more air defense and push more strategic assets farther from the front. Even more importantly, the Kremlin then has to create more propaganda, explaining to its citizens why the war they were told was under control keeps arriving in their refineries, their airports, and possibly even in the capital city. Taken together, the three fronts of the drone war paint a single coherent picture. A country that entered this conflict with every conventional advantage is now being systematically dismantled by a smaller adversary that had no choice but to innovate, and that's been doing so in a live fire testing environment for 4 years straight. Now, if you want to learn more about any particular type of drone that Ukraine uses, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show. We post daily videos that detail exactly how drones are used, where they're used, and how effective they are at any given day. One of the most elegant aspects of Ukraine's technological evolution is the way it's inverted what defense analysts call the cost exchange problem. In conventional warfare, this problem is central to any attacker's calculus. It costs far more to shoot down a weapon than to launch it, which means an attacker can eventually exhaust a defender's interceptor stockpile by flooding the zone with cheap munitions. Russia has been attempting this strategy with its Shahed-type attack drones, mass-producing them at the Alabuga Special Economic Zone in Tatarstan and launching them in waves of hundreds at a time. Ukraine has flipped this equation and done so in a way that compounds in its favor. Ukraine's Sting FPV interceptor drone cost approximately $2,100. The cheapest Russian Shahed-type drone cost a minimum of $35,000 per unit, nearly 15 times as much. During Russia's massive drone assault in mid-May 2026, it used 1,567 attack drones launched in a single coordinated strike. Ukraine intercepted 1,473 of them, meaning it managed a 94% interception rate. The Sting alone accounted for over 100 kills. Interceptor drones overall accounted for roughly 30% of all the drones brought down. That's a cost exchange that favors Ukraine by an order of magnitude in every single engagement. More importantly, the Sting is built from commercially available components using 3D printing. It requires no specialized manufacturing infrastructure. It doesn't even depend on high-end microelectronics that might be restricted by sanctions or disrupted by supply chain shocks. Ukraine can build more of them quickly and cheaply in distributed manufacturing facilities that are themselves difficult to target. Russia's Shahid program, conversely, is still a sustained production effort conducted at centralized facilities. It also heavily depends on cooperating with Iranian suppliers, and Iran itself isn't faring so well, considering it has its own conflict to fight in the Middle East. Ukraine's success in the drone war has not gone unnoticed by the rest of the world. By March 2026, over 200 Ukrainian drone pilots had deployed to the Persian Gulf to help US and Gulf state forces counter Iranian drone attacks. Ukraine's SkyMap anti-drone command and control platform was operating at the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia after Iranian Shahid drones caused more than $1 billion in damage to US facilities in the region. Defense agreements were signed with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. A drone cooperation deal with the United States was described as currently being reviewed at different institutional levels. The country that Russia invaded, expecting to eliminate as a geopolitical entity in a weekend, has become a recognized global leader in unmanned warfare with paying clients. Russia, meanwhile, is running in the opposite direction on every metric. Its electronic warfare capability is degrading because the microelectronics it requires are increasingly difficult to source. Its drone operator recruiting is falling dramatically short of its own targets. Its fiber optic FPV program is being kneecapped by a supply chain cost surge of its own making. Every direction it turns to solve its technological problems leads back to sanctions it invited by making the strategic choice of overconfidence in February 2022. There is a fourth dimension to this conflict that receives less attention than the tactical one, but may ultimately matter just as much. The psychological and informational war being waged against Russian society itself. Putin's original bargain with Russian citizens was that the war in Ukraine was a special military operation where they didn't have to worry about anything. In fact, Muscovites didn't even need to support the war, as most of the conscripts weren't from there, and the idea was that the fighting would be long over before the repercussions reached large cities. But 4 years later, there is an increasing number of Russian citizens who live within drone range of the Ukrainian border, up to and including Moscow itself. These people have spent 4 years watching Ukrainian drones fly over their cities, strike at Russia's oil infrastructure, light refineries on fire, and ground their airports. Russia even imposed mobile internet restrictions in multiple cities in an attempt to prevent drones from using network signals for navigation, showing just how low it could stoop to try to defend its effort. The question you might be asking at this point is, can't Russia just adapt? Can't it acknowledge the failure, commit the resources it should have committed in the first place, and grind its way to some kind of victory through sheer mass and persistence? The answer is no, and understanding why requires holding all four threads of this analysis together simultaneously. The first reason is the sanctions trap, and it deepens with time. Every month that passes, Russia's military-industrial base drifts further behind the technological frontier it needs to compete. The most consequential weapon systems of the modern battlefield, such as drones, AI guidance, and electronic jamming systems, all require the kind of advanced semiconductors and microelectronics that Russia can't easily produce domestically or even reliably import. Yes, it has a lot of sanction evasion schemes, mainly from Central Asia and surrounding China. But these only add to the cost, as Russia has the decisive disadvantage in negotiations. And they can even be disrupted as Western governments refine their enforcement mechanisms. The second reason is manpower mathematics that are now moving in Ukraine's favor. Russia's theory of victory has always depended on a manpower advantage. You send more people, accept more losses, grind the defender down through sheer weight of numbers. For 3 years, that model held. Russia's casualty rate was brutal, but its recruitment rate kept pace. Then in January 2026, that shifted. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, Russia's casualty rate surpassed its recruitment rate, according to the Institute for the Study of War. In March 2026, Zelensky estimated that Russia lost approximately 89,000 troops while recruiting only 80,000 over the previous 3 months. The cost per square kilometer has also become catastrophic. Ukrainian estimates suggest Russian forces lost around 120 personnel per square kilometer of captured territory in 2025. By 2026, as drones came to dominate the battlefield, that figure had risen to approximately 316 killed and wounded per square kilometer, more than double in a single year. Russia is paying more and receiving less. Recruitment is collapsing in parallel. Daily recruitment figures for the first quarter of 2026 fell between 800 and 1,000 individuals, a 20% decrease from the 1,000 to 1,200 per day seen in 2025, according to an analysis from Russian Finance Ministry data. Sign-on bonuses reached a new all-time high of 1.47 million rubles, when the average yearly wage is 1.29 million rubles. Yet the numbers kept falling. When you have to keep raising the price and fewer people are still showing up, the market is telling you something. Then there's another demographic trap behind the manpower numbers. The population Russia most needs, that being educated, technically capable young people, is the exact population most determined not to serve. Instead, around 40% of recruits are now drawn from what are vulnerable population groups: prisoners, debtors, and those with few other options. The soldiers Russia is sending to face 21st century drone warfare are increasingly being sourced from the margins of its society, while the people who could actually operate those systems are leaving the country, avoiding conscription, or hiding from the recruitment officers showing up at their workplaces. Third, we have the technological and innovation aspect that we covered. Ukraine has had 4 years of live combat experience developing, iterating, and refining every aspect of unmanned warfare. Its engineers have been testing designs in actual combat conditions with real-time feedback loops measured in days. Its operators have developed tactics that evolve weekly in response to Russian countermeasures. Its commanders have integrated drone intelligence into decision-making at every echelon of the battlefield. This is not knowledge you can acquire by simply throwing money at a problem, and it's vastly different from even the traditional Western model of military procurement and development. And Russia doesn't even have that much more money or people to throw at the problem. GDP growth for 2025 came in at approximately 1%. For 2026, Russia's own government has revised its growth forecast down to just 0.4%, and the economy contracted by 0.3% in the first quarter, its first quarterly contraction since early 2023. Meanwhile, Russia's 2025 military spending was $190 billion, or 7.5% of GDP, the highest share since the Soviet Union's collapse. In 2026, the budget was expected to account for approximately 40% of total federal expenditure, continuing the trend of sky-high investments in the military. Even then, it had to lower the military budget to compensate, admitting that it wasn't enough. To partially fund this, Russia raised its VAT rate from 20% to 22% at the start of 2026. Interest rates that reached 21% to fight military spending-driven inflation have come down to around 16%, which is basically crippling for the civilian economy. And the structural problem runs deeper than any single number. Military-industrial investment is consuming labor, capital, and raw materials at the expense of every other sector. Russia's labor shortage is illustrated by the fact that the official unemployment rate is just 2.2%. This is a figure that sounds like prosperity, but actually reflects the fact that the country has run out of spare workers. In the civilian economy, the part that would need to sustain Russia through a long war, only agriculture and manufacturing showed sustained growth in the first half of 2025. Everything else stagnated or shrank. This matters for the central argument because it closes a door Russia might otherwise have used. A country with a healthy, growing economy can absorb the cost of a long war, retool industries, invest in new technologies, and recruit the people it needs. Russia is doing the opposite. Its economy is shrinking, its military spending is declining in real terms even as the war grinds on. Its civilian industries are being hollowed out because the same people who should be working in them are being conscripted and shipped to fight in the war. The fourth reason is structural, and perhaps the most fundamental. Russia's military is still trying to fight a deep battle war using Soviet command structures against an adversary that has specifically optimized itself to exploit every weakness of that model. The centralization that Russian doctrine requires is a vulnerability Ukraine knows how to target. The air superiority that Russian ground operations assume hasn't existed over Ukraine for 4 years and won't exist for as long as Ukraine has surface-to-air missiles and a functioning industrial base to replace them. And while NATO is responsible for the sanctions that stop Russia from getting access to some weapons, Russia is not losing this war because of NATO. It's not losing because of Western weapons or Ukrainian courage, or Zelensky, or any other of the factors that dominate the mainstream conversation about this conflict. Those things matter, but they're not the cause, just consequences. Russia is losing because in February 2022, the people in charge of the world's largest country looked at their military, looked at Ukraine, and decided they could take it with a fraction of their strength in a weekend without triggering the kind of international response that would close off their technological lifelines. They were wrong about all three things simultaneously, and the three errors compounded each other in ways that were catastrophic and irreversible. The force they sent was definitely not enough to win quickly. The adversary they faced was not the hollow post-Soviet shell they remembered from 2014. And the international response was more comprehensive and more durable than they had calculated. Had they been right about even one of those three things, the strategic outcome might have been different. Being wrong about all three meant they had no way out. By the time Russia understood the scale of its error, it was fighting a war it needed to commit its full weight to, under conditions that prevented it from accessing the technology it required. It was trying to fight a 21st century drone war under a 20th century sanctions regime, with a military doctrine designed for an adversary that had already moved on and a command culture too rigid to adapt at the speed the battlefield demanded. That's not a problem you can solve with more manpower. It's not a problem you can solve with more drones or more missiles or more of anything Russia currently produces. It's not even a problem you can solve with time, because the more time passes, the more Ukraine only gets ahead. Every month, Ukraine's drone industry gets more capable, while Russia's access to the technology it needs gets harder to maintain. The attrition mathematics move further in Ukraine's direction, and maybe the Russian public gets a little more accustomed to drone strikes, airport closures, and oil fires, and a little less certain what the war is actually supposed to accomplish. Which brings us back to Moscow from now on never sleeps. Ukraine has demonstrated that it can strike the Russian capital at will, degrade Russian oil infrastructure at scale, collapse Russian logistics chains from 160 kilometers behind the front line, and shoot down over 90% of the attack drones Russia throws at it for a fraction of their production cost. For many, the holy grail for Ukraine's long-term security would be its accession into NATO. The logic is simple. Membership in the world's largest and most powerful military alliance would bring the full force of the other 31 members to bear on Ukraine's side, the ultimate deterrent against future Russian aggression. But what if it's actually the other way around? What if Ukraine's entrance into the alliance would be at least as beneficial for NATO as the other way around? Before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the idea might have seemed laughable, but it's not that far-fetched anymore. In fact, it's quite the contrary. In 2025, Ukrainian drone operators invited to participate in NATO's Hedgehog 2025 exercises in Estonia forced officials to reset the training several times after quickly inflicting unacceptable casualties on British and Estonian units, not once, but repeatedly. Now, in the Aurora 2026 NATO exercises held in Sweden, they've done it again, and they've exposed NATO's most dangerous weaknesses in the process. Here's how Ukraine's drone crews shredded NATO's defenses and tactics, and why it matters. Ukraine established a relationship with NATO in the 1990s, following its independence from the collapsed Soviet Union. But the relationship has been growing in leaps and bounds following Russia's invasion and Ukraine's subsequent application for NATO membership in 2022. In particular, Ukraine has increasingly been invited to participate in NATO's various military exercises in Europe. For example, Ukraine has hosted and/or participated in the annual Sea Breeze exercises since 1997, usually held in the Black Sea, but held in the UK in 2025. Ukrainian observers and experts also participated in the massive Steadfast Defender 2024 exercise, the biggest NATO drill since the end of the Cold War, involving more than 90,000 military personnel from 31 NATO allies. But in those and other earlier exercises, Ukraine was more or less a junior partner, there for the training, to enhance interoperability, and essentially to learn from NATO. That started changing in 2025. Thanks to its hard-won experience fighting Russia, the alliance has increasingly started positioning Ukraine as an expert at its exercises, there to teach and add value rather than to learn. At the REPMUS 2025 exercises in Portugal, Ukrainian teams deployed sea drones that sank a NATO frigate in simulation, highlighting asymmetric naval threats. And at the Spring Storm 2026 exercises in Estonia, Ukrainian representatives participated alongside forces from the US, UK, France, Germany, and others. But it was at the Hedgehog 2025 exercises in Estonia that Ukraine really made its mark. The exercises brought together more than 16,000 troops from 12 NATO countries. They trained alongside Ukrainian drone operators, including military personnel temporarily seconded from the front lines. Together, they simulated a contested and congested battlefield with various types of drones. The result was unexpected and shocking for NATO. In one of the training scenarios, a combat group of several thousand soldiers, including troops from the participating British Brigade and the Estonian Division, attempted to launch a mechanized attack. Facing off against them was a Ukrainian drone unit consisting of around 10 soldiers. The Ukrainians were equipped with their drones and Delta, a modern Ukrainian battlefield management system. Delta collects intelligence in real time, uses artificial intelligence to analyze large amounts of information, identifies targets, and coordinates strikes between command and units. The NATO forces didn't stand a chance. In about half a day, the Ukrainian drone operators reportedly destroyed 17 armored vehicles and delivered 30 strikes on other targets. In one simulated battle, Ukrainian drones reportedly wiped out 2 NATO motorized infantry battalions attempting to attack an objective by driving through thick woodland that trapped vehicles on roads. According to Ivar Haniot, the coordinator of unmanned aerial systems for the Estonian Defence League and a participant in the exercise, within the scope of the exercise, the 2 battalions, effectively lost their combat capability. Meanwhile, he said NATO units didn't even get to our drone operators. As another unidentified participant recalled, the NATO combat group simply moved without any camouflage, setting up tents and armored vehicles. All of this was destroyed. Now, some defense experts have been raising the alarm for some time that the war in Ukraine has fundamentally changed the way war is waged, and that NATO risks being left behind. The Hedgehog 2025 exercises represented a serious wake-up call for the alliance. Now, Ukraine has repeated the trick, and those warnings have evolved into large red flags. The Sweden-led Aurora 2026 exercises ran from April 27 to May 13, 2026. Taking place largely in southern and central Sweden and the Baltic Sea, the exercise mobilized a reported 18,000 troops across land, sea, and air forces from 13 countries: the host Sweden, the US, the UK, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Canada, Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine. Even Sweden's Crown Princess Victoria was present, dressed in full military gear. The wide-reaching exercises practiced defending Sweden against naval raids, joint ground and air operations, and emergency movement of troops and material to a threatened region. But the main event was a force-on-force defense of the Swedish island Gotland in the western Baltic against a simulated Russian hybrid war attack. As Rear Admiral Jonas Wikström, the Swedish exercise director, described it, the scenario is that on the eastern side of the NATO border, like Finland and the Baltic states, we have a massive buildup of enemy units, a concentration of units on that side, and we also have, within Sweden and other allied nations, hybrid activities. It's an increased level of hybrid activities like sabotage, cyber attacks, influence operations, things like that. That translated to a pair of Ukrainian drone teams acting as adversaries as part of the notional Russian force attacking Gotland. The first was from the 1st National Guard Brigade Buravei, and the second from the 20th National Guard Brigade Lyubart. Attempting to defend against them were some 17,300 Allied troops. These included formations from Sweden's South Skåne Regiment, the Luftvärnsregementet LV6 Air Defense Regiment, and the 32nd Home Guard Regiment, alongside elements of the US Marine Corps 3rd Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company, the Combat Logistics Battalions 24 and 27, Danish Home Guard troops, and British infantry. More than 17,000 of NATO's finest against a handful of Ukrainian drone operators. On paper, it's a complete mismatch. But on the ground, NATO's forces suffered some of the same damage as they did at Hedgehog 2025. During the last 3 days of the exercises from May 11 to 13, the NATO units were tasked with defending key installations under a Russian attack combining conventional military assault with unconventional war tactics. As we'll discover a bit later on, this distinction between conventional and unconventional is a fundamental part of NATO's problem. The Ukrainians' role in the exercise was to act as Russian attackers using drones. The Ukrainian units were operating standard, domestically manufactured FPV drones fitted with directional antennas and extended life batteries. The operators weren't equipped with anything special by the standards of the war in Ukraine. They controlled their drones with the commercial tablets, Game Boy analog control units, and off-the-shelf viewing goggles that you find throughout Ukraine's military. To repel this seemingly humble attacking force, NATO's defenses included state-of-the-art Swedish Gripen fighter jets, Archer long-range howitzers, advanced CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, and Leopard 2A8 main battle tanks, among others. Unexpectedly, that array of advanced and very costly equipment got pulverized. A Ukrainian pilot, identified as Tarek, told the Associated Press that his unit's successful attacks forced the organizers to stop training and return troops and equipment that had been notionally destroyed by attack drones back to life 3 times. According to a statement from the Ukrainians' First Corps, due to the effectiveness of the Ukrainian FPV pilots, their participation in certain stages of the exercises was even curtailed so that other units could complete the exercises without completely losing their equipment to Ukrainian drones. Now, in one mechanized assault scenario, a Ukrainian crew working alongside Swedish pilots wiped out 28 of approximately 32 pieces of major equipment. In another, Ukrainian FPV swarmed and destroyed the defenses of a military airfield in less than 20 minutes, hitting all targets successfully with no drones lost. It was humiliating. But to make matters worse from NATO's perspective, the Ukrainian drone units weren't even its most elite. That was at least a mitigating factor in the Hedgehog 2025 embarrassment. Those exercises involved Ukraine's feared Nemesis unit, aka the Armed Forces of Ukraine's 412th Unmanned Systems Forces Brigade, one of the USF's standout drone units. Since the start of 2026 alone, the elite brigade has reportedly destroyed 20 Russian tanks, the equivalent of 2 full tank companies. Overall, since 2022, they're credited with destroying or damaging nearly 200 tanks, 300 armored fighting vehicles, and more than 1,000 vehicles. The unit has also taken out a growing number of sophisticated Russian air defense systems, including Tor M2, Buk M3, and OSA launchers, as well as Borisogleb's 2 electronic warfare stations. In one instance, they eliminated 3 such air defense systems worth an estimated $80 to $90 million in a single month. They're also innovators. In April 2026, Nemesis achieved a global first by destroying a Russian Geran attack drone using an interceptor drone launched from an unmanned surface vessel, or USV. So it's not that much of a surprise that a team with Nemesis's experience and expertise would lay into NATO defenses with the same skill and ferocity as they do to the Russians all the time. But that wasn't the case in Gotland. At the Aurora 2026 exercises, the Ukrainian participants were more or less standard units that Ukraine deploys across the vast front lines. Both the Buravet and Lyubart teams are combat-seasoned, reliable, and competent fighting outfits, but they're not considered to be at the elite level of Ukraine's Special Forces commandos or USF forces like Nemesis. The 1st Brigade's Organic Drone Battalion, Condor, participated in the training. Fairly typical of AFU drone units, Condor operates almost exclusively Ukraine-manufactured observation, kamikaze, and bomber drones, and NATO couldn't cope with them. Now, click the like button if you're enjoying the video, and hit that subscribe button if you want more like it. Here on The Military Show, we deliver fresh updates and sharp analysis on the most important stories daily. Subscribe now so you never miss out. So, why did the NATO forces fare so badly against Ukraine's compact drone units? Well, according to Anatoly Merkotun, a large part of the reason is outdated tactics. Former police detective Merkotun is the commander of Nemesis and a familiar name in Ukrainian drone circles. He was an early proponent and developer of the USF's now ubiquitous bomber drone technology, and one of the pioneers of using small drone video-derived imagery and data fusion to develop intelligence and conduct strikes more efficiently. So he's well qualified to comment. In a post-exercise interview, he said that the NATO tactics of keeping fighting vehicles and troops in compact groups seemed nearly suicidal, pointing out that both the Russian and Ukrainian armed forces had abandoned that way of fighting years ago. Indeed, it's become rare to see armored columns on maneuvers in Ukraine or deployed in groups of more than 2 or 3 at a time. Drones are already responsible for 70 to 80% of battlefield losses on both sides, with Russian FPV and other kamikaze drones, which cost around $400 each, destroying several M1 Abrams tanks worth $8 to $10 million per unit. Russian losses are of course much higher than that. Their tanks and armored vehicles might not cost quite as much, but they've been getting wrecked by Ukrainian drones at a scarcely believable rate. And of course, it takes much longer to produce an expensive piece of armor than it does to churn out thousands of cheap, deadly FPV drones. The problem is, it's not just Russia and Ukraine that have embraced this new technology. By the looks of it, Israel is losing advanced Merkava tanks, Namir armored vehicles, bulldozers, and other heavy equipment at a rapid rate in Lebanon. The Hezbollah militia is wreaking havoc against its much more powerful foe with FPV and fiber optic guided drones. The Israeli invasion has suffered as a result, and casualties of both troops and equipment are soaring, just like for Russia in Ukraine. As the Israeli newspaper Times of Israel puts it, Israel should have seen it coming but was caught off guard. Evidently, so has NATO. Meanwhile, all of NATO's main rivals appear to embrace the new technology and adapt to their military doctrines accordingly. And despite a massive effort on the alliance's part to remedy this situation, the gap appears to still be growing. Peel away the bravado, and Iran has basically fought the US and Israel to a strategic standstill in the Persian Gulf, using long-range kamikaze drones, innovative ballistic missiles, and asymmetric tactics. Even more concerning are new military developments from China, especially in the use of AI-enabled drones. In March 2026, China unveiled the Atlas Drone Swarm Operations System. In footage that looks straight out of a sci-fi movie, a single operator controlled a swarm of 96 largely autonomous drones simultaneously. In January, they showcased a single operator controlling a swarm of 200 drones in tight formation, but the March showcase was next level. In the demonstration, the swarm launched drones at 3-second intervals, achieving full airborne status in less than 5 minutes. Once launched, the drones use swarm intelligence algorithms to autonomously coordinate reconnaissance, electronic jamming, decoying, and kinetic strikes. They can communicate with each other to avoid collisions, reconfigure formations in real time, and independently identify and lock onto targets without continuous human input. As we've seen with Ukraine's AI-enabled, largely autonomous Hornet drones, Ukraine isn't far behind in terms of autonomous individual drones or even smaller swarms. So are many other Western designers and developers. In fact, in some ways, the US's own mass drone swarm program, Replicator, is ahead of China's. Launched primarily to counter China's growing prowess in the field, the Replicator initiative successfully met its goal of fielding thousands of attritable autonomous systems across air, sea, and land domains in August 2025. By early 2026, the program evolved into Replicator 2, which focuses on counter-drone swarms and further scaling production, marking a shift from demonstration to active deployment. So technically, while China is still in the early demonstration phase, the US is already fielding hundreds of autonomous drone swarms. But there's a big difference. The Atlas system suggests that China is focused on centralized homogeneous swarms. Replicator aims for something else entirely: heterogeneous integration. In other words, connecting different types of drones from different vendors like Anduril, Shield AI, and Skydio into a single, centrally controlled network force. Unlike Atlas's single centralized swarm, Replicator integrates diverse platforms like the XQ-58A Valkyrie and various small UAVs. All the different drones are coordinated by advanced AI software like Anduril's Lattice and Shield AI's HiveMind. These systems are designed to operate in GPS-denied and communication-jammed environments, autonomously collaborating to identify and engage targets. As you can imagine, it's a much more technically complex process to get right than a single unified drone swarm, and likely to be many times more expensive. Perhaps most tellingly, nothing remotely as visually impressive as the Atlas demo has yet been made public by the program. But that's the US, which has identified China as its main adversary, not NATO. NATO's main rival isn't China, at least not yet. It's Russia. And while Russia is making incremental progress in developing its own autonomous drone swarms, Ukraine seems to be several steps ahead. But autonomous drone swarms are an emerging technology, not yet entrenched. And in many senses, as Ukraine keeps exposing in exercises, NATO isn't as prepared for the threat Russia already poses as it should be, especially in the far north. It would be a mistake for NATO to be lulled into a false sense of complacency by Ukraine's recent successes with drones and asymmetric tactics, impressive and damaging as they are. Like Ukraine, Russia has been compelled to adapt to the new way of waging war in real time on the battlefield. NATO hasn't. Russia, to a large extent, has transitioned to a wartime economy and now fields the world's largest industrial-scale drone ecosystem outside China. It's steadily institutionalizing combat lessons from Ukraine. And if it wants to compete, it doesn't have a choice. Following Kyiv's lead, Moscow has established a dedicated branch for unmanned systems, expanded mass training of drone operators, and is forming new drone units across the joint force. Annual drone production now exceeds 1.5 million drones across types and sizes, with Western intelligence services expecting further sharp increases driven by Chinese industrial support and sanctions evasion. In the Arctic, Russia is likely to use drones as integrated force multipliers, enabling persistent ISR along Arctic littorals and the Northern Sea route, queuing bastion coastal defense systems, supporting anti-submarine and anti-surface operations, and conducting long-range strikes with one-way attack drones and advanced missiles. These activities will be tightly coupled with aggressive cyber and electronic warfare to degrade Allied sensing, targeting, and command and control capabilities. To combat all of that effectively, NATO won't be able to rely solely on its traditional dominance in air power and warships. It'll have to fight fire with fire, or drones with drones. And as Ukraine has demonstrated, it's not yet quite up to the task. That's not to say the alliance isn't taking the threat very seriously and acting accordingly. Look no further than the forthcoming Silent Swarm 2026 exercises scheduled for July 2026 in Estonia. Although originally primarily a US Navy-led event, it's taken on an increasingly international nature over its 4 previous editions, 2022, 3, 4, and 5. The 2026 edition will showcase the alliance's evolving doctrine for countering autonomous drone swarms and integrating manned-unmanned teaming across land and air domains. With a focus on electronic warfare, AI-enabled autonomy, and layered short-range air defense, Silent Swarm 2026 clearly reflects NATO's urgent response to the lessons from Ukraine. On a more practical level, at the Aurora 2026, Ukrainian trainers shared their experience in using UAVs, coordinating units, and working in conditions of active electronic warfare in briefings to Swedish, French, United Kingdom, and Netherlands service members. According to Andres Gustafsson, Swedish commander of the brigade combat team taken to the cleaners by the Ukrainian crews, they are miles ahead of us when it comes to drone warfare, so we really appreciate them coming here to share their experience with us, and we have a lot to learn from them. But there's a lot more that NATO needs to change if it wants to master next-generation warfare post-haste. According to a Ukrainian drone operator identified as Garat, who took part in Aurora 2026, NATO forces have potential but need significant improvements in drones, tactics, and understanding of drone warfare at the commander level. And it starts with the alliance's doctrine. As noted earlier, during Aurora 2026, the alliance considered the use of drones to be unconventional. It underscores how, despite recent updates, NATO doctrine still treats drones largely as supplements to deterrence and defense rather than core elements. The consequence, as Garat suggested, is that commanders lack mature concepts for integrating unmanned systems into multi-domain operations against a drone-enabled adversary like Russia. Recent initiatives to support concept development, standardized training, and operational experimentation are definitely steps in the right direction, but more is likely required. Training pipelines and innovation pathways will also need to be urgently established and refined. Ukraine has had to develop these rapidly and under fire, adapt or die, so to speak. But assembling the solutions and the humans to design and operate them is likely to be significantly more difficult across a 32-nation alliance than a single nation like Russia or Ukraine, and that's without considering integrating everything coherently. Capital to fund all of this will also need to be mobilized and rationalized. At the moment, while private capital is starting to flood into military startups and advanced tech, the allocation of both public and private capital into next-generation defense spending is a bit of a free-for-all to say the least. Structures to consolidate and streamline production, like Ukraine's Brave One marketplace, will likely need to be established within the alliance to ensure interoperability and efficient resource allocation. Brave One allows individual Ukrainian units to buy a government-approved range of weapon systems directly, reducing red tape and providing flexibility while ring-fencing procurement to reinforce interoperability. NATO needs to get the balance right. Without strong, systemic demand for key platform categories such as tactical ISR drones, loitering munitions, and unmanned logistics vehicles, the risk is that allies will continue paying premium prices for bespoke systems while Russia floods the regions with battle-proven mass-produced platforms. So, an urgent overhaul is needed, and an urgent overhaul is underway. But will it be too little too late? In the end, it may well turn out that NATO needs Ukraine more than Ukraine needs NATO. Nothing beats experience, and Ukraine has bottomless amounts of it. If the results of Hedgehog 2025 and Aurora 2026 are anything to go by, for NATO, it might be a case of if you can't beat them, join them. Or in this case, let them join you. We'll obviously keep you updated as we learn more, so subscribe to the channel to hear about it first. In the meantime, check out this video about a genius way a Ukrainian engineer discovered to steal Russian drones. Thanks for watching.